The crack of bone was louder than the horse's cry. One moment Dust Devil was eating up the trail, the next his front leg was gone, swallowed by a snake hole hidden in the alkali dust. The big roan went down hard, a cloud of white powder rising around him as he thrashed. Rip was on his feet before the dust settled, his boots clear of the stirrups. He'd learned that lesson years ago. He walked to the horse's head, stroking the damp neck, murmuring things that didn't mean anything but sounded right. The roan's eyes were wide with panic, the broken bone jutting sharp and ugly from his foreleg. A man could set a bone. A horse, you just couldn't. Rip pulled the colt from his hip. The metal was hot from the sun. He didn't look at the horse's eyes again. He pressed the barrel behind the ear, into the soft hollow there. The shot was a flat bark in the empty desert. The roan shuddered once and was still. The silence that followed was heavier than before. He slid the saddle from the warm back, then the bridle. He hefted the saddlebags over one shoulder and the saddle over the other. The weight of it pulled at him. He looked back at the horse one last time, a dark shape already shimmering in the heat. Then he started walking. An hour passed, maybe two. The sun was a hammer. The only sound was the scuff of his boots and the creak of his leather. Then he heard another sound, a rhythmic squeal, wood on wood, metal on stone. He stopped, tasting the grit on his teeth, and turned. A freight wagon was crawling up the trail behind him, pulled by two tired-looking mules. A man sat hunched over the reins, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Beside him, another man held a greener shotgun across his lap, its twin barrels catching the sun. The wagon drew level, the driver pulling the mules to a halt without a word. The man with the shotgun had a face like a dried-up creek bed. He squinted at Rip, then at the saddle on his shoulder. "Lose your ride." Rip nodded. "Snakehole." The driver spat a stream of brown juice into the dust. "This country's full of M. Breaks your axle, breaks your horse. Hell on a man's temper." He looked Rip up and down. "Where you headed, as far as this trail goes?" "That'd be Harmony Creek." The guard said. "If we get there before the damn wheels fall off, they ain't gonna fall off." The driver grumbled. "I told you. I greased them this morning." He looked at Rip again. "We ain't a stagecoach, but the back's empty enough. Cost you $1, I can pay," Rip said. He swung the saddle into the wagon bed, landing it next to a heavy, canvas-wrapped crate. He tossed his saddlebags beside it and climbed in, the wagon rocking with his weight. The driver snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward with a groan. "Name's Cully," the guard said over his shoulder, not bothering to turn around. "This here's Jed." Jed just grunted. Rip settled against the crate, the shade of the wagon's canvas a small relief. He watched the desert scroll by, the heat waves turning the distant mesas to water. He wondered if the buzzards had found Dust Devil yet. "You hear that?" Cully said suddenly. Jed didn't seem to hear anything. "Hear what?" "Your stomach growlin' for supper." "No," Cully said. He shifted, bringing the shotgun up. Sounded like the first shot was a sharp crack from the ridge to their right. It took Jed in the neck, throwing him sideways against Cully. He was dead before he started to fall. The second shot came an instant later, hitting Cully square in the chest. He dropped the shotgun and slumped forward, his face hitting the footboard with a dull thud. The reins fell from Yet's dead hands. The mules, spooked, kept pulling. The wagon rolled on, its two drivers slumped on the seat, leaving a trail of blood in the white dust. The wagon wheels hit a rock, and the whole frame shuddered. Jed's body tipped, almost falling out onto the trail. The mules just kept walking, dumb animals following a road they knew. Rip didn't wait for them to stop. He was already moving, low and fast. He left the saddle. Too much weight, too much to carry. He grabbed the leather handle of his saddlebags and vaulted over the side of the wagon. His boots hit the ground running. He didn't look back. A bullet sang past his ear, a high, angry wasp. Another kicked up dust a foot from his boot. He cut left, away from the trail, heading for a jumble of red rocks and sun-scorched sagebrush. Men were yelling from the ridge now, their voices thin in the open air. He heard the thunder of horses' hooves coming down the slope. Rip dove behind a slab of sandstone that was hot enough to cook on. He risked a look. 4 riders, closing fast. They were spread out, trying to flank him. Amateurs. He laid the barrel of his Colt along the top of the rock, the metal sight a clean black line against the glare. He waited. Not for the closest man, but for the one who thought he was clever, the one swinging wide to get a better angle. The man stood up in his stirrups to get a clear shot. Rip squeezed the trigger. The rider flew backward off his horse as if he'd been kicked by a mule. The horse shied and bolted. One of the other riders reined in hard, his mouth opened. He was young, a boy with more fuzz than beard on his chin. He raised his rifle. Rip's second shot took him in the throat. The boy dropped his gun and clutched at his neck, sliding slowly from the saddle. The other two wanted no part of it. They wheeled their horses around, digging in their spurs and heading back for the ridge, yelling curses over their shoulders. "You're a dead man," one of them screamed. "Slade's gonna gut you for that." Rip didn't answer. He was already moving again, deeper into the rocks, putting distance between himself and the trail. He didn't stop until he found a deep, dry wash carved out by 1,000 years of flash floods. He slid down the sandy bank and collapsed in the shade of an overhang, his lungs burning. He waited, listening. There was nothing but the wind and the buzz of a fly. He pulled the saddlebag onto his lap. It felt wrong, heavier than it should be. The leather was different, too. Newer. He unbuckled the straps. His gear wasn't inside. No spare cartridges, no jerky, no worn copy of a book he'd read a dozen times. Instead, the bag was stuffed with thick bundles of paper, each tied with string. He pulled one out. It was heavy, engraved paper. At the top it read, "The Harmony Creek Bank and Trust." Below that, it said, "Bearer, Bond." And below that, $1,000. There were dozens of them. Hell, Rip whispered to the empty air. He'd grabbed the wrong bag. Back at the wagon, a man named Slade swung down from his horse. He was a big man with a thick black beard and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the two dead men on the wagon seat, then at the bodies of his own men out in the rocks. He showed no emotion. "Find it," he said to the man beside him. The man, skinny and nervous, scrambled into the back of the wagon. He tossed Rip's saddle onto the ground. He rummaged for a moment. "It ain't here, Slade." "What? The bank crate? It's here. But the bag, the leather satchel, it's gone." Slade walked to the back of the wagon and looked for himself. He saw Rip's saddle, he saw the crate. He saw the other saddlebag, Rip's actual bag, lying half open near the tailgate. But the one with the bonds was gone. "The walker," Slade said, his voice low and dangerous. "The one Cully and Jed picked up." He took it. He looked toward the wash where Rip had disappeared. "He killed Paco and the kid, and he took our money." The surviving rider swallowed hard. "He's just one man, Slade." Slade turned his cold eyes on him. "He's one man who can shoot. And he's got something that belongs to me." He looked out at the endless, shimmering desert. "Find his trail. I don't care if you have to follow him to the devil's front door. Find him, miles away, hidden in the wash." Rip finished the last of the water in his canteen. He counted his bullets, 4 left in the Colt. He shoved the bonds back into the bag, buckled it, and stood up. He had a fortune he didn't want, and a whole mess of trouble he couldn't shake. He picked a direction and started walking. The clock on the wall of the Harmony Creek Bank and Trust ticked loud enough to count a man's sins. Elias Abernathy heard everyone. He stood at the window, staring out at the empty sun-bleached street. It was 3 in the afternoon. The freight wagon from Sterling was 4 hours late. He smoothed the front of his wool vest, a useless habit. "They should have been here," he said to the empty room. "Cully knows the schedule. Jedediah knows the schedule." The clock ticked, the sun beat down. Nothing moved on the street but the heat rising from the dirt. Abernathy grabbed his hat. He couldn't stand it another minute. He locked the front door of the bank, the bolt shooting home with a heavy clank, and marched across the street to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was cleaning his shotgun, the pieces laid out on a piece of oilcloth on his desk. He looked up when Abernathy burst through the door, a cloud of dust and sweat following him in. "My shipment, Sheriff, it's gone." Brody looked at the banker over the top of his spectacles. He took his time, wiping a spot of grease from the gun's receiver with a clean rag. "Gone, Elias, or just late. It's never been this late. That's my money out there. The town's money. It's Cully and Jed driving that wagon," Brody said, his voice calm and even. "They're steady men. Steady men get shot." Abernathy snapped. "Steady men get robbed. I want a posse. Now." Brody sighed. He set the receiver down carefully. He knew the banker was right to worry. Jed and Cully were too reliable. "All right, Elias, settle yourself." He walked to the door and looked out at the livery stable. Jericho, a man, emerged from the shade of the stable. He was tall and lean, with the high cheekbones and dark eyes of his mother's people. He moved without a sound, his steps measured and sure. He crossed the street and stopped in the doorway, waiting. He didn't speak. "Jet's wagon from Sterling ain't come in," Brody said. "Ride south, see what you find." Jericho nodded once and was gone. "A tracker," Abernathy said, his voice dripping with scorn. "I need rifles, not a man who can tell me which way the wind is blowing." "He'll find your wagon," Brody said, turning back to his desk. "Then we'll know if we need rifles." He began putting the shotgun back together with practiced ease. "I'll get some boys together. We'll ride out as soon as Jericho gets back." Abernathy watched him for a moment, his face tight with impatience. He didn't trust the slow, deliberate pace of the law. He turned and left without another word, letting the door slam shut. He didn't go back to the bank. He went to the saloon. The place was quiet in the afternoon heat, mostly empty. In a corner booth, a man sat alone, nursing a beer. The man's name was Flint McCrae. He was polishing the cylinder of a Schofield revolver with a small, oiled cloth. He didn't look up as Abernathy approached. "Mr. McCrae." McCrae pushed the cylinder back into the revolver's frame. It clicked into place with a sound like a lock closing. Banker Abernathy slid into the booth, his hands fidgeting on the table. "I have a business proposition. I'm not looking to make a deposit. A shipment of mine is missing," Abernathy said, leaning in, his voice a low whisper. It was due this afternoon. It carried assets. McCrae took a slow drink of his beer. He watched Abernathy over the rim of the glass. How much in assets? Enough to matter, Abernathy said evasively. The sheriff's on it, I suppose. Brody is a good man, but he is methodical. I require a more direct approach. McCrae set his glass down. You want me to follow the posse? I want you to find my property. Brody can have the culprits. I want the assets. There will be a bonus if you are successful before the sheriff. McCrae leaned back, his eyes unreadable. He looked at the banker's pale, worried face. He thought for a moment. 202 ride. 2,000. If I bring back your bag, I don't ask what's in it, you don't ask how I got it. Abernathy didn't hesitate. Done. Then buy me another beer, banker, Flint McCrae said, pushing his empty glass across the table. It's going to be a long ride. The sun was a hammer. It beat on Rip's head, his shoulders, the cracked leather of his boots. He kept to the high ground, moving through a maze of canyons and rockfalls that would kill a horse. The saddlebag full of money banged against his hip with every step, a constant, heavy reminder of his mistake. He thought of the two men on the wagon seat, Cully and Jed. He hadn't known them 5 minutes, but he could still see their faces. The driver, with eyes lost in the dust of 1,000 miles. The guard who'd offered him a chew of tobacco. They were dead because he'd wanted a ride. Guilt was a new taste in his mouth, bitter as alkali dust. He swallowed, his throat too dry for it to go down. He found a sliver of shade under a granite ledge and rested. He was climbing toward the cinder peaks, a place where a man could disappear if he was smart and lucky. He wasn't feeling lucky. He looked north, toward the jagged black mountains. It was a long walk. An hour later, Sheriff Brody's posse reined in at the abandoned wagon. The mules stood dumbly in their traces, heads drooping. Flies buzzed, thick around the two bodies slumped on the seat. Get him down, Brody said, his voice flat. He swung down from his horse. He didn't look at the dead men. He'd seen enough dead men. He looked at the details. The splintered wood of the wagon bed where bullets had hit. The brass casings glinting in the dirt. Jericho slid from his pony and walked the ground in a slow circle. He moved like a ghost, his eyes on the story that dust had to tell. He pointed. 4 riders came down from the ridge. Over there, he looked toward the rocks. 2 of them stayed there. Brody walked over. He saw the 2 dead bandits where they'd fallen. He nudged one with his boot. Amateurs, they chased a man on foot, Jericho said, his gaze sweeping from the wagon to the wash. He went that way fast. He knelt and picked up a pinch of dirt. One man, big boots, in a hurry. Jericho walked the trail for 20 yards, then stopped and looked north. He's heading for the cinders. One of the deputies, a young man named Cale, spat a stream of tobacco juice. Who in his right mind would go up there on foot? Someone who ain't in his right mind, Brody said, or someone who knows what he's doing. He looked at Jericho. What about the other 2 riders? They went back up the ridge. Met with another man, a big one, they argued. Then they rode east, hard and fast. Slade, Brody said to himself. It had his stink all over it. Robbery was one thing. Leaving bodies was Slade's way of signing his work. 3 trails. Sheriff, Jericho said, standing. Bandits, east. 1 man north. And us, from a half-mile back. Flint McCrae watched the posse through a pair of field glasses. He saw them find the bodies. He saw the tracker, Jericho, move across the ground. McCrae lowered the glasses. He didn't need to get closer. He knew the story, a deal gone wrong, a loose end. He spurred his horse, not following the posse's tracks, but cutting a wide angle to the north. Brody would follow the trail. McCrae would follow the man. 3 separate hunts, all moving under the same merciless sun. The law, looking for a killer. The bounty, looking for a bag of paper. And the bandits, looking for the man who had shot their friends and taken their prize. They were all chasing Rip, and Rip was just trying to outrun the ghosts of 2 men he'd barely met. The rock under Rip's boots was black and sharp, like broken glass. It tore at the worn leather. The sun, finally starting to dip toward the horizon, offered no relief. It just changed the angle of the attack. Thirst was a living thing in his throat, a fist made of sand. He saw the mine by accident. A dark slash in the side of a hill, almost hidden by a rockslide and a dead, twisted juniper. Old timbers, bleached gray by the sun, framed the entrance. A scrap of rusted tin lay half buried in the scree. It was a place that had been given up on a long time ago. It was perfect. He scrambled up the loose rock, his boots slipping, sending a cascade of small stones rattling down the slope. He froze, listening. Nothing. He ducked under the main timber and stepped out of the sun. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and rot. It was a relief. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. A tunnel shored up with more rotting timbers, led back into the hill. He followed it for 20 feet, feeling his way along the rough-hewn wall. He found a small alcove, a side chamber where miners had probably stored their tools. He dropped the heavy saddlebag. The thud was loud in the silence. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. He needed to see. He fumbled in his trouser pocket and pulled out a small tin of sulfur matches. 3 left. He struck the first one on the rock wall. The flare of it was blinding. He saw a rusted pickaxe head, a broken shovel handle, and an old mule's skull. Against the back wall sat a tin lantern, its glass pane cloudy with dust. He lit the wick just as the match burned his fingertips. He swore and dropped it. The lantern's flame was weak, but it pushed the darkness back. He picked it up and held it to his face. The man in the reflection on the glass was a stranger, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked, a long scratch sweeping a thin line of blood down his cheek. He had scrapes on his hands from the dive into the rocks. He tore a strip from the bottom of his shirt, uncorked his canteen, and used the last few drops of water to wipe the grit from the cuts. He sat down on the hard floor, the lantern beside him. He should sleep, he should rest. But his mind wouldn't stop. He saw the guard, Jedediah, smiling. He saw the young bandit clutch his throat. He looked at the saddlebag. That bag was the start and the end of it. He reached for it, then stopped. He didn't want to see the paper inside. He didn't want to be reminded of what he was carrying. 5 miles back, Flint McCrae dismounted. He ran a hand along his horse's neck. Easy, boy. Almost there. He wasn't following the tracks. The posse could have the tracks. McCrae was following the man's mind. He knew the type. A man running on foot, low on water, would look for high ground, but he would also look for the path of least resistance. He would follow the folds in the land. He would look for shade. McCrae looked up at the black, jagged peaks. He knew where he would go. He found the scuff marks on the slope leading up to the mine. A man in a hurry. A man getting tired. McCrae didn't draw his gun. He moved quietly, his steps making no sound on the loose rock. He saw the dark opening. He put a hand on the timber, feeling the grain of the old wood. He knelt. Beside the entrance, almost invisible against the dark rock, was a small pile of freshly disturbed stones. He looked closer. He saw a boot print. He walked a few feet away and found a spot where a man had rested. A small fire had been built there, a traveler's fire, meant for a quick cup of coffee. He put his palm flat on the ashes. They were still warm. McCrae stood up and looked into the black mouth of the mine. He didn't need to see the man. He could feel him. He was close. The sound was faint at first, the chink of a horseshoe on rock. Rip was on his feet before he was fully awake, the lantern guttering in his hand. He moved to the mouth of the mine, staying deep in the shadow. He peered out. Down the slope, 3 riders were picking their way through the scree. They weren't trying to be quiet. One of them was cursing his horse. It was the 2 who had run from him, and a third man, thick in the shoulders, who looked mean enough to bite nails. It wasn't the law. It wasn't the bounty hunter. It was Slade's men, coming back to finish the job. Rip looked up. Above the mine entrance, a balancing rock the size of a fat sow perched on the ledge. It had been waiting 100 years to fall. He didn't think. He blew out the lantern, plunging the tunnel into blackness, and felt his way back to the small side chamber. He grabbed the rusted pickaxe head. He scrambled back out of the mine, not through the main entrance, but up a narrow chimney of rock he'd noticed earlier. He came out on the hillside 20 feet above the entrance, his hands raw, his lungs heaving. The riders were closer now, almost at the bottom of the slope. "He's in there," one of them said. "I can feel it." "Then we burn him out," the thick one growled. Rip wedged the pickaxe head into the crevice under the balancing rock. He put his shoulder into it and pushed. The rock groaned. It shifted an inch. "What was that?" the rider below said, looking up. Rip pushed again, every muscle screaming. The rock scraped, resisted, then gave way. It tipped slowly, impossibly, then crashed down the slope with the sound of thunder, trailing a river of stones. It didn't hit the riders. It hit the ground 10 feet in front of them. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground. The horses screamed and reared, eyes wild with terror. One went over backward, crushing its rider. The thick-shouldered man was thrown clear, but his partner was still in the saddle of his panicked horse. The horse bolted straight into a wall of rock. The sound of the impact was a wet crunch. The third rider got his horse under control. He stared at the 2 bodies, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked up the hill, his hand going for his gun. He never got there. "Drop it." A voice boomed from the trail below. Sheriff Brody and his posse had ridden up on the noise. They sat on their horses, 5 men with rifles leveled. Jericho was beside them, his face impassive. The lone bandit stared at the lawman, then at the mine, then back. He was trapped. From his perch half a mile away, Flint McCrae watched it all through his glasses. The rockfall, the arrival of the posse, a perfect mess. "Federal, march out," the bandit screamed, a wild lie born of desperation. "This is our jurisdiction." Brody wasn't buying it. "I don't see a badge. I see 2 dead men and a third with his hand on a gun. Last chance." The bandit made his choice. He pulled his revolver and fired a wild shot that kicked up dust 10 feet from Brody's horse. The world exploded in gunfire. The posse's rifles answered as one. The bandit was stitched across the chest, thrown from his saddle. Before his body hit the ground, Another shot cracked from the rocks near the dead men. The thick-shouldered bandit, the one who'd been thrown clear, had found cover. A bullet tore a chunk out of the pommel of Brody's saddle. "Spread out," Brody yelled, swinging down from his horse as his deputies dove for whatever cover they could find. McCrae lowered his glasses. He shook his head. The banker's money was in the middle of a war, and the man he was hunting, the man who started it all, was nowhere to be seen. The shooting sputtered out with the last of the light. A few angry shots, an answer, then silence. A man started screaming, down in the rocks, and then he stopped, too. The night came on fast, the sky a deep, bruised purple with a handful of early stars. Rip didn't move. He lay flat on the ridge above the mine, the hard rock still holding the day's heat. He listened. Men were calling to each other below. The sheriff, his voice a low bark. One of his deputies, sounding young and spooked. They were making a camp. They weren't leaving. He had to go back. The saddlebag was still in the mine, a fortune in paper he wished he'd never seen. He eased backward from the ledge and slid down the far side of the hill, his boots making soft, scraping sounds in the gravel. He moved in a crouch, circling around until he was at the rockslide again, the mine a black mouth in the gloom. He drew his Colt. The weight of it felt good in his hand. 4 shots left. He took a breath and slipped inside. The cool, dead air wrapped around him. He stood dead still for a full minute, listening to his own blood pounding in his ears. Nothing. He felt his way to the side chamber. His fingers brushed against the smooth, worn leather of the bag. He grabbed it, slung it over his shoulder, and backed out of the tunnel, as quiet as a ghost. He couldn't go down. The posse owned the low ground. He had to go up and over, putting the cinder peaks between him and the law. He started climbing, using the noise of the posse setting up their camp to cover his own. A horse whinnied. A man coughed. A canteen rattled against a saddle horn. Rip froze at every sound, a shadow among shadows. He reached the top of the ridge, his lungs burning. He lay flat for a moment, catching his breath, and looked back. He could see their campfire, a small orange flower blooming in the darkness. He was clear. He got to his feet and started down the other side, moving faster now. The ground was treacherous, all loose shale and hidden drops. He was thinking about water. His tongue was a piece of dry wood in his mouth. He unslung his canteen, the metal cool against his hand. He found a flat spot behind a cluster of yucca and sat down, leaning his back against the rock. He set the canteen on the ground beside him. Just one sip. Make it last. He wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The saddlebag felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He shifted it on his shoulder. He reached for the canteen without looking. His fingers brushed against something dry and scaled. It coiled. The strike was a hot needle in the fleshy part of his hand, between thumb and forefinger. He jerked back with a grunt, his hand on fire. He saw the snake, a diamondback, coiled and ready to strike again, its rattle a dry, furious buzz in the silent dark. He didn't have time to aim. He fired the Colt from his hip. The blast was deafening. The snake convulsed, its body lashing against the rocks. In the flash from the muzzle, he saw his canteen. He'd knocked it over when he pulled his hand back. It was rolling, bouncing down the steep, dark slope, its metal cap making a series of faint clicks and chinks against the rocks until it was gone. He stood up, his heart hammering. He stared into the blackness where his water had gone. He looked at his hand. 2 small punctures, already turning dark. He pulled his knife, the blade scraping against the sheath. He pressed the tip against the wound. Down below, the sound of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. "What was that, Cale?" the young deputy said, jumping to his feet. Jericho didn't move from his spot by the fire. He looked up at the black ridge line. A man saying goodbye to his last bullet. Brody grunted. "Or a snake." "Sometimes," Jericho said, staring into the flames. "They're the same thing." Rip didn't hear them. He was watching his own hand swell, the skin pulling tight and shiny. He sliced a shallow X across the 2 fang marks, the steel cold against his hot skin. Dark blood welled up. He brought the wound to his lips and sucked, the coppery taste of venom and blood filling his mouth. He spat, a dark splash on the gray rock. He did it again. The poison was a fire spreading up his arm. He staggered to his feet, the world tilting, and started moving, a dead man walking into the heart of the night. The sun came up hot and white, bleaching the color from the rocks. Sheriff Brody was drinking the last of his coffee, the tin cup warm in his hands. Cale, his youngest deputy, was staring at the 3 dead bandits laid out under a dusty blanket. "Stop looking at them," Brody said, without turning around. "They won't tell you their secrets." "Just seems a waste," Cale said. "It was their choice to waste themselves. Go check the horses." As Cale walked off, 2 figures came down from the ridge. One was Jericho, moving with a silent, easy grace. The other was Flint McCrae. He'd left his horse tied a ways off and come in on foot. He moved like a man who never wanted to be heard. Brody sighed. "McCrae, I figured you were sniffing around out here. A lot of shooting for a quiet night," McCrae said. His eyes weren't on Brody. They were scanning the rocks, the mine, the place where the posse had made their camp. He saw everything. You find the banker's bonds. We found 3 men who needed killing. Brody said, the rest is under investigation. Jericho didn't speak. He walked over to Brody and held something out. It was a spent shell casing. Found it up on the north ridge, Jericho said. His one shot. Brody grunted. What was he shooting at in the dark? McCrae walked over. He looked at the shell, then up at the ridge. He started walking, not waiting for an invitation. Brody watched him go, then swore under his breath, and followed, with Jericho a step behind. They found the spot easily. The ground was scuffed, a yucca plant was trampled, and lying in the dust was a big diamondback rattlesnake, its head blown apart. Well hell, Brody said, shot a snake. McCrae knelt. He wasn't looking at the snake, he was looking at the ground beside it. He pointed with his chin. See that? Dark stain on the rock. And here, he touched a small, almost invisible smear on a cactus needle. Blood. Jericho was already circling the area. Trail goes on, he called out, his voice flat. But he's walking heavy, dragging his left foot. The snake bit him, McCrae said. He stood up and brushed the dust from his knees. Bit him, he shot it, and in the confusion, he took a few steps, his eyes on the ground, reading the story. He stopped and pointed down the steep slope. Halfway down, wedged between 2 rocks, was Rip's canteen, dented and empty. He lost his water, Brody said. It wasn't a question. He lost everything, McCrae corrected him. He's afoot, no water, and full of venom. The sun will finish him before noon. He looked at Brody. Your man is as good as dead. Sheriff, you can pack up your posse and tell the banker his bonds are coyote meat. Brody looked up at the vast, shimmering emptiness of the cinder peaks. He thought of the paperwork, the inquest, the ride back to town. Yeah, Brody said slowly, you're probably right. McCrae smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. Probably. He walked away without another word, heading back toward his horse. He wasn't going back to town. Brody knew it. Jericho knew it. You trust him? Jericho asked, his gaze following McCrae. I trust him to want his money, Brody said. That's not what I asked. Brody poured the dregs of his coffee onto the ground. He watched the dark stain disappear instantly into the thirsty dust. He looked up at the trail Jericho had found, leading off into the killing heat. No, Brody said. I don't. McCrae knew the sheriff was wrong. A normal man would be dead by noon. But a man who could drop 2 riders with 2 shots while running for his life, who could rig a rock slide in the dark, and who still had the presence of mind to shoot the head off a snake that had just bitten him, that man wasn't normal. He was dangerous, and a dangerous man, a cornered man, was the most interesting kind of man to hunt. The world was made of glass, and the sun was a hammer. Everything shimmered. The rocks ran like water at the edge of his vision. Rip kept walking. 1 foot, then the other. The saddlebag full of someone else's money was an anchor pulling him down into the heat. His hand was a swollen, purple claw. The fire from the snakebite had climbed to his shoulder and was working its way into his chest. He stumbled, catching himself on a saguaro. The needles dug into his good hand. He didn't feel it. A man in a dusty blue uniform walked beside him for a while. The man's face was a blur of smoke under the brim of his cap. You're out of line, Corporal, the man said, his voice like grinding stones. Fall back in. IRIP turned his head. There was no one there, just the sun beating on the rocks. He closed his eyes. Open them. The man was back. Water discipline, the man snapped. You know the rules. Rip's tongue was a piece of sun-baked brick. He couldn't have spoken if he wanted to. He just kept walking. He came to the edge of the salt flat. It spread out before him, a sea of cracked white mud that stretched to the hazy mountains on the other side. There was no cover, no shade, just the white glare and the hammer of the sun. The man in blue was gone. Rip stepped onto the salt. The ground crunched under his boots like broken bone. He put his head down and walked, following his own shadow, a long distorted thing that wavered in the heat. After an hour, there were more of them. Not just the corporal. A whole squad, marching in a ragged line on either side of him. Ghosts in blue, their faces streaked with grime and shadow, their rifles held at a low ready. They didn't speak to him. They just marched, their phantom boots making no sound on the salt. A boy, couldn't have been more than 17, fell into step beside him. I heard they got Sheridan bottled up good, the boy said, his voice a dry whisper. You think we'll see action before sundown? Rip. Shut up, Miller. Rip heard himself rasp. His own voice was a stranger's. The boy named Miller smiled, a sad, knowing thing. Too late for that. He held out a canteen. Here, you look like you could use it. Rip's hand twitched. He knew it wasn't real. He knew it. But his thirst was a living creature, a beast with claws and teeth, latched onto his throat. He reached for it. His fingers went through the canteen, through the boy, and touched nothing but hot, empty air. The boy and his canteen dissolved into the shimmering heat. All the ghosts were gone. He was alone in the white, silent world. He fell. His face hit the hard-baked ground, the salt crust scraping his cheek. He lay there, the sun cooking the back of his neck. He should stay here, just close his eyes. It would be easy. He thought of the men who had shot the old driver and the guard. He thought of Slade, the man they'd named, a man who would send boys out to die for a bag of paper. He thought of the posse behind him and the man McCrae, who walked like a cat and saw too much. They were all hunting him. They all thought he was going to lie down and die. No, he breathed into the salt. He got one arm under him, pushed. The world spun. He got to his knees, his head hanging. The saddlebag was a dead weight. He thought about leaving it, just letting the desert have it. But it was the reason they were hunting him. It was the only thing that mattered to them. He got it back on his shoulder. He stood up, swaying. He looked across the endless white far away, at the edge of the flat where the mountains began. He saw a dark shape, a smudge against the shimmer. It could have been a rock. It could have been another ghost. Or it could have been the mouth of a canyon. Shade, a chance. He took a step, and another. He walked toward the smudge, the ghosts of Miller and the others falling back into step around him. Their silent march, the only thing that kept him moving. The shade was a physical thing. Rip walked into it, and it was like stepping into cool water. He leaned against the canyon wall, the rough red rock sucking the heat out of his back. The world stopped shimmering. The ghosts were gone. For a moment, there was just the blessedly deep shadow and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He slid down the wall until he was sitting in the dust. He had to rest, just for a minute. His swollen hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He looked at it. It was ugly. The skin stretched tight and shiny. The poison was a thick, slow fire in his veins. Then he heard it, the clink of a horseshoe on rock. Far off, but getting closer. He didn't think. He reacted. He got to his feet, the saddlebag, a lump of lead on his shoulder. He looked down the canyon the way he'd come. Nothing. He looked the other way, deeper into the narrow passage. It twisted and turned. A snake's path through the mountains. His only way out. He started to stumble forward. The sound came again, closer this time. Voices. A man laughed. They were behind him. They had crossed the salt flat faster. On horses, Rip pressed himself against the rock wall. It was a straight-sided chute, maybe 20 feet across. Nowhere to hide. He was trapped. He looked up. The canyon walls were steep, a maze of cracks and ledges. A lizard could climb it. A goat, not a dying man. He heard the horses clearly now, their hooves crunching on the gravel floor of the canyon. There, a voice yelled, dead ahead. I see him. Rip looked up again. A ledge, 30 feet up. A shadow. A chance. He slung the saddlebag around to his chest, the heavy buckle digging into his ribs. He found a crack in the rock, a place for his boot. He started to climb. His muscles screamed. His bad hand was useless. A club, he used his elbow, jamming it into fissures in the rock. He found a handhold with his good hand, pulled himself up, his boots scraping for purchase. What in God's name is he doing? It was Slade's voice, echoing off the walls. He's climbing. Another man yelled, a note of disbelief in his voice. Rip didn't look down. He just kept going. His world shrunk to the next handhold, the next crack for his boot. The rock was hot, abrasive. It scraped the skin from his knuckles. He heard a bullet whine past his head and smack into the cliff face, spraying him with rock dust. He reached the ledge and rolled onto it, his chest heaving. He was exposed, but he was above them. He peered over the edge. 4 of them. Slade was in the lead, his face a mask of fury. A big man with a greasy beard was dismounting, raising his rifle for another shot. The other 2 were staring up, their mouths open. Rip's Colt was in his belt. 1 bullet, maybe 2. He wasn't sure he could even hold it, let alone aim. He scanned the ledge. It was littered with loose rock, shattered pieces of the cliff face baked brittle by the sun. He found one the size of a skull and shoved it over the edge with his boot. It landed with a sickening crunch on the head of the rifleman's horse. The animal screamed and went down in a heap, trapping the man's leg underneath. The man, Gus, howled in pain and rage. Rip sent another rock over, and another. They rained down on the canyon floor. The 2 other riders panicked, trying to control their terrified horses. Slade was screaming at them, trying to get them to spread out. He's one man. Shoot him, you useless bastards. Gus, his leg pinned, finally got his rifle untangled. He aimed it up at Rip, his face white with pain. I see you, you son of a bitch. Rip knew he couldn't stay there. He slid off the other side of the ledge, landing hard in a chute of loose gravel. He half slid down the steep incline, landing on the canyon floor, 50 yards past the chaos. He was on his feet and running. Gus fired, the shot going wide. Slade saw Rip and spurred his horse forward, leaving his men to sort themselves out. Rip was a dead man. He knew it, then he saw it. Gus's horse, the one that wasn't pinned, was standing nearby, its reins trailing, its eyes wide with terror. It was limping, favoring its right foreleg where a rock had glanced off it. Slade was closing. Rip could hear the horses breathing. He gave one last desperate push and threw himself at the lame horse, grabbing the reins. He hauled himself into the saddle. He didn't bother with the stirrups. He kicked the horse's ribs, hard. The horse bolted, its limp throwing Rip from side to side. A bullet tore through the cantle of the saddle, inches from his hip. He looked back. Slade was stopped, his pistol smoking. Gus was still trapped under his dead horse. The other two were just getting their own mounts under control. Rip turned forward and rode, the half-lame horse carrying him deeper into the twisting canyon, away from the man screaming his name. He had a horse. Flint McCrae sat his horse at the canyon mouth, letting the animal blow. He could smell it before he saw it, the coppery scent of blood on the hot, dry air. He drew his pistol, not because he expected a fight, but because it was a habit, and habits kept him alive. He nudged his horse forward at a walk. The scene was a mess. A dead horse lay sprawled in a narrow passage, its head caved in. Flies were already gathering. Underneath it, a man's boot stuck out. McCrae didn't need to check to know the man was dead, too. You didn't survive having a horse fall on you like that. Further on, another body was sprawled face down in the dust. McCrae dismounted and walked over, nudging the man with his toe. Gus, he recognized the greasy beard. He'd seen him spending the banker's money in the Harmony Creek Saloon a week ago. There was a small, neat hole in the center of his back. An exit wound. Rip hadn't killed this one. This was Slade's work. Tying up loose ends, McCrae's eyes read the ground like a book. He saw the tracks of 4 horses coming in. He saw where one rider, Gus, had dismounted. He saw the scuffed earth and scattered rocks from the landslide. He looked up and saw the ledge, 30 feet high. He saw the slide of gravel down the other side. He followed the tracks of a man running, then the tracks of a lame horse being mounted in a hurry. He saw where Slade had stopped, fired a shot, then turned his horse in a tight circle of pure rage. Then the tracks of 3 horses, leaving the one lame one, carrying a single rider, going deeper into the canyon. The man should be dead 10 times over, snakebit, no water, hunted, and still he fought. Still he ran, still he was moving. McCrae almost smiled. This was getting interesting. He mounted his horse and rode on, following the tracks of the lame animal. He was no longer hunting a man. He was hunting a ghost. Hours later, Sheriff Brody and his posse reached the same spot. The sun was starting to dip, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and blood. Cale, the young deputy, took one look at the scene and turned away, his face pale. "That's it," a man named Henderson said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice. "We've lost him. We're chasing a dead man and burning good daylight." "Jericho," Brody said, ignoring him. The tracker was already off his horse, circling the area. He moved with a quiet focus, his dark eyes missing nothing. He came back to Brody after a few minutes. "McCrae was here," he said. He read the whole story and kept going. "And our man, he stole a horse. Lame one. Kept going, too, but the trail is cold now. Wind has been through here. Scoured the ground. I could find it, maybe. But it would be slow going, and in the dark." Jericho shrugged. It was his way of saying it was impossible. Brody looked at the faces of his men. They were done. He could see it in their slumped shoulders, in the way they avoided his eyes. They were farmers and storekeepers, not manhunters. They'd done their duty. "All right," Brody said, his voice flat. "Henderson, you and the boys take the bodies back to town. Cale, you go with them. Tell Judge Miller I'll need an inquest." Cale looked surprised. "What about you?" "Sheriff, I'm going on," Brody said. Henderson laughed, a short, sharp bark. "On your own, after a man who did this? That's suicide." "Brody." "Maybe," Brody said. He looked down at the dead man. Gus, he'd seen him around. A loudmouth, a bully, but just small-time hired muscle. Not the kind of man you found in the middle of a $100,000 bond robbery. This whole thing stinks. The banker, the way the wagon was hit. These men, it's not just about the money. There's something else going on here. A ghost hunt is what it is," Henderson muttered. "Go on home, Henderson," Brody said, his voice quiet but with an edge of steel. "Your wife is waiting." The men didn't argue. They were relieved. They set about the grim business of tying the bodies onto their horses. Cale hesitated. "Sheriff, you sure about this?" "I'm sure I was elected to see things through to the end," Brody said. He looked at Jericho. "You coming?" Jericho looked up at the darkening sky, then down the black throat of the canyon. "He is either the devil himself or the luckiest man alive. Either way, I would like to see which." Brody nodded once. They watched the posse ride away, their forms shrinking in the twilight until they were gone. Then the two of them, the lawman and the tracker, turned their horses and rode into the canyon, following a trail that no one else could see. The sky had been a bleached-out white all day. Now it was turning the color of a bad bruise. The air grew heavy, thick, and still. There was no wind, just a waiting silence. Even the buzzards that had been circling high above were gone. Rip felt it before he saw it. A change in the pressure, a feeling on his skin like a held breath. He urged the lame horse on. The animal was stumbling, its head low, foam flecking its lips. Every fourth step was a painful lurch as its bad leg gave way. They were moving at a crawl, leaving a pathetic, dragging trail across the cracked earth of the badlands. "Come on, you bastard," Rip rasped. His own voice was a dry crackle. "Just a little further." The horse didn't respond. It was an engine running on its last drop of fuel. The poison from the snakebite had settled into a deep, grinding ache in Rip's bones. His vision swam in and out of focus. He clung to the saddle horn, the landscape a smear of reds and browns. He was riding through a furnace. A low rumble echoed from the west. So deep, it was more a feeling in his chest than a sound. The horse's ears twitched. It stopped, its whole body trembling. "Don't you quit on me," Rip growled, kicking its ribs with what little strength he had left. The horse took 3 more lurching steps. Then its front legs buckled. It went down without a sound, a sack of bones hitting the dirt. Rip threw himself clear, landing hard on his shoulder. He lay there for a moment, the dust soft as flour under his cheek. The horse tried to get up, struggled, then lay its head down with a long, final sigh. Its sides heaved, once, twice, and then were still. Rip got to his knees. He was alone. The silence was absolute. He looked at the sky. A dark wall of cloud was rolling in, eating the horizon. A flicker of light danced inside it, silent and menacing. He pushed himself to his feet. He had the saddlebag. That was it. No horse, no water, no weapon, except a knife and a revolver with maybe 1 bullet left in it. He started walking. He didn't know where he was going. Away, that was the only direction he had. The first gust of wind hit him like a fist, stealing his breath and filling the air with a choking red dust. It tore at his clothes, a physical force trying to push him back. He leaned into it, his head down, 1 foot in front of the other. Then the lightning came. Not just a flicker, but a violent, angry slash of white that lit up the entire world for a split second. It struck a mesa a mile away, the crack of thunder instantaneous and deafening. It wasn't rain, it was war. Rip kept walking. He was a solitary, ragged figure, moving through a world coming apart at the seams. The wind howled, a rising scream. The dust was so thick he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. Another bolt of lightning hit, closer this time. And in its dark, brutal light, he saw the badlands transformed into a landscape of jagged teeth and deep, black shadows. He was going to die out here. The thought wasn't frightening. It was just a fact. He was too tired to be scared. He was too thirsty to care. He just kept putting 1 foot in front of the other because that's all there was left to do. The first drop of rain hit his face. It wasn't a drop. It was a pellet of mud, a mixture of water and the dust the wind had whipped into the air. Then another, and another. He stopped and tilted his head back, his mouth open, letting the gritty, lukewarm water hit his tongue. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. The drizzle became a downpour, a torrential, blinding sheet of water that turned the ground to slick mud under his boots. The world was noise and water and flashing light. He was soaked in seconds. He was freezing. He was alive. He slid the heavy saddlebag off his shoulder, clutched it to his chest, and kept moving, disappearing into the heart of the storm. The sun came back with a vengeance. It baked the wet red earth into a cracked plate, the steam rising in waves that made the air wobble. Rip felt the heat through the soles of his boots. He found a handhold in the rock, the stone warm and gritty. He pulled his right arm, taking all the strain. His left was a swollen lump of meat, purple and useless, lashed to his chest with a strip torn from his shirt. He gained a ledge and rolled onto it, the rough surface scraping his cheek. He lay there, his breath sawing in and out of his lungs. Below, the canyon was a maze of shadows and sharp, bright light. No movement. It didn't matter. He knew they were back there. The man who moved like a cat, the sheriff who wouldn't quit. They were coming. Your skyline soldier, get your head down. Rip didn't open his eyes. The voice was sand and smoke, a sound from another lifetime. The corporal, no one there. Rip rasped to the empty air. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. There's always someone there. You learned that at Shiloh Church, didn't you? You get lazy. You get dead. Now move. He pushed himself up with his good arm. The saddlebag slung over his shoulder, dug into his neck. The weight of it was wrong. It was just paper, but it felt heavier than gold. It felt like sin. He looked at his swollen hand. The skin was stretched tight, shiny as a new-blown blister. The 2 fang marks were black. Angry eyes, staring back at him. The poison was a slow fire that had worked its way up to his shoulder, a deep ache that sat in the bone. He started climbing again, a crack for his boot, a nub of rock for his hand. The motion was all he had. Climb, rest, climb again. He tried not to think about water. Thinking about it made his tongue swell in his mouth. He thought about the corporal instead. It was better than thinking about being thirsty. Pain is a luxury, corporal. It means you're still breathing. You stop feeling it. That's when you worry. He found a deeper shadow under a granite overhang and slid into it. He had to rest. The world was starting to tilt at the edges. A boy sat across from him, cleaning a rifle with a greasy rag. He couldn't have been more than 17, a ghost in a sweat-stained blue uniform. "Miller, heard you got a promotion." "Rip," the boy said. His voice was a dry whisper. "Lance Corporal, figured you would." Rip stared at him. The hallucination was so clear he could see the fraying on the boy's collar, the nick in the rifle's wooden stock. "It wasn't a promotion. Felt like one to me." leading the picket line, out front of everybody. Miller looked up from the rifle, his eyes clear and empty. You were supposed to watch the flank. You said you would. Rip pressed the back of his head against the rock. The stone was hot. It felt real. I saw a rider. On the ridge. Thought he was one of ours. He wasn't, Miller said. He went back to cleaning the rifle. His movements slow and deliberate. They came out of the trees, a whole line of them, gray jackets and smoke. We never had a chance. He held out a canteen. You look thirsty, Rip. Go on, take it. Rip's good hand twitched. He knew it wasn't real. He knew, but the thirst was a claw in his throat. He reached, his fingers went through the canteen, through the boy, and closed on nothing. Miller and his rifle dissolved into the shimmering heat. The silence that came back was worse than the voice. It was empty. It was accusing. He had left them. He had seen the rider, made a choice, and left his flank exposed. Miller and 3 others had died in the first volley. The guilt was a cold, hard knot he'd carried for years, a thing he never spoke of. It was the reason he walked alone. It was the thing that had brought him here, to this rock, to this sun, to this slow death. He looked down at the canyon again. A flicker of movement, a man on a horse, a mile back, maybe more. Just a speck, but the speck was moving with purpose. It wasn't Slade's men. They rode loud and angry. This was quiet, patient. It was McCrae. Rip got to his feet. He pulled the saddlebag higher on his shoulder. The paper rustled. $100,000. Enough to buy a whole new life. Enough to bury the old one. He looked from the rider to the jagged black line of the cinder peaks on the horizon. It was a long walk. They're gaining on you, soldier. The corporal's voice echoed in the silent heat. What are you gonna do? Rip put one boot in front of the other. He started walking toward the peaks. I'm gonna keep moving. The rain had washed the world clean. It left behind the smell of wet creosote and dark, hungry earth. The sky was a pale, depthless blue. Sheriff Brody sat his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking as he shifted his weight. He looked at the ground. It was a blank slate of red mud, pockmarked by the last of the falling drops. Anything? Brody asked. Jericho stood 20 feet away, his back to the sheriff. He didn't answer. He was a statue, his gaze fixed on a place where a wash, still running with a trickle of brown water, cut through the canyon floor. The storm had erased everything. It had scrubbed the tracks of men and horses from the land. It had tried to make it so yesterday never happened. Brody waited. He knew the tracker's way. You didn't ask him questions. You let the silence ask for you. He pulled the makings from his saddlebag, rolled a cigarette with stiff fingers, and struck a match on his thumbnail. The smoke was a thin blue ribbon in the still air. Jericho took 3 steps, his boots making no sound on the damp ground. He knelt. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. The water was higher, Jericho said. His voice was flat, a part of the landscape. An hour ago, it was a foot deep right here. Brody blew a smoke ring, and this rock, Jericho pointed with his chin at a fist-sized piece of granite, was not here yesterday. It was rolled here by the water. He looked up at Brody, but the mud underneath it is dry. Brody squinted, looking at the rock, then at Jericho. He didn't see it. Someone put it there, Jericho said. He stood up and walked a few paces, his eyes scanning, reading a language Brody couldn't speak. After the hard rain stopped, to mark a spot, he walked another 10 feet and knelt again, his fingers tracing something in the air just above the mud. McCrae, you're sure? He thinks like a mapmaker, Jericho said. He knows the water would wash out the trail, so he leaves a sign. For himself, he wants to know which way his man went. Jericho stood and pointed north, up a steep, broken slope that led out of the canyon and toward the black teeth of the cinder peaks. That way, Brody finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into the muddy water. It hissed and went out. A man with a snake bite and no water climbing that. After what he's been through, he is not a man anymore, Jericho said, swinging up onto his pony. He is a prayer, or a curse. He just keeps going. They rode for an hour, Jericho in the lead. There was no trail to follow, not one that Brody could see. But Jericho moved with a quiet confidence, his eyes on the high ground. He'd pause, study a bent branch on a juniper, or a place where a small cascade of pebbles had been disturbed, and then move on. You figure McCrae is ahead of us. Then, Brody said, mostly to hear a voice. He was smarter than Slade's men. He cuts the corners, but the storm made us all equal. It made us all blind. Jericho reined in. He was looking at something ahead. Not anymore. They'd come over a rise. Sprawled on the cracked earth below was the body of the horse Rip had stolen. It lay on its side, its legs stiff, its eyes open to the empty sky. Buzzards were already gathering. Circling in slow, patient loops, Jericho slid from his horse and walked the ground around the dead animal. Brody dismounted and followed, his spurs chinking. He rode it until it died, Brody said. No, Jericho corrected him. He pointed to a set of tracks, already hardening in the sun. A single set of boot prints, deep at the heel, leading away from the horse. It died, and then he got up and walked away. He touched a spot on the horse's flank. The hair was matted and dark. He took a drink first. used his knife. Brody saw the small, neat puncture wound in the horse's neck. The man was drinking blood to stay alive. "Sweet Jesus," Brody whispered. Jericho looked up from the tracks. He stared at Brody, his dark eyes unreadable. "You asked the banker for $2,000 to pay for a posse. He gave you 5. He did not argue. The change in subject threw Brody. "He's a rich man, worried about his money." "He is a careful man," Jericho said, "and he hired Flint McCrae." "A man does not hire McCrae to find a bag of paper. He hires him to bury a secret." Jericho stood and brushed the dust from his hands. He looked at the boot prints leading north. "This is not about money, Sheriff. It never was." Brody looked at the dead horse, then at the single set of tracks marching into the brutal, sun-drenched emptiness of the badlands. A man full of poison, drinking horseblood, climbing toward a place where nothing lived. And 2 men were still hunting him. 3, if you counted the banker's ghost. "No," Brody said, his voice a low growl. "I'm starting to think it never was." He pulled himself back into the saddle. "Let's go." Flint McCrae saw the buzzards first. They were black specks turning lazy circles against a sky the color of bleached bone. He didn't need to spur his horse. The animal knew its job. It picked its way through the rocks, sure-footed and calm, until they came over the rise. The dead horse lay below them, a collapsed bag of hide and bones. McCrae dismounted, the squeak of his saddle leather loud in the silence. He didn't look at the buzzards. He walked a slow circle around the carcass, his eyes on the ground. He saw the boot prints, a single set, walking away. He saw the place where the man had knelt. He saw the small, dark puncture wound in the horse's neck, the edges of it already crusted with black flies. "Thirsty," McCrae said to his horse. The animal flicked an ear. He followed the tracks for 50 yards. They were unmistakable. The man was dragging his left foot, the boot sole scuffing, a shallow trough in the dirt. He was favoring his right side, leaning heavy. The snake bite, the fall he took in the canyon. It was adding up. A normal man would be a corpse already, lying beside his dead horse, waiting for the buzzards to get brave. This man just kept walking north. McCrae looked up at the cinder peaks. They were a wall of jagged black rock that tore at the sky. A place for lizards and ghosts. No water up there. No shelter. Nothing but a slow way to cook. He went back to his horse and pulled the canteen from his saddle. He took a short pull, the water tasting of tin and cool relief. He wasn't worried. The man was a ghost, but even ghosts get tired. McCrae swung back into the saddle. He didn't follow the tracks directly. He knew where they were going. He rode parallel to them, saving his horse, his eyes scanning the black ridges ahead. He was no longer chasing. He was herding. 10 miles east, Slade kicked the embers of the fire. A plume of gray ash rose and scattered in the wind. He turned and looked at the 2 men who were left. One was named Tector, a man with a nervous twitch in his eye. The other was the boy, Harlan, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "He's one man," Slade said, his voice a low growl. "One man on foot, and he took us apart." Tector wouldn't meet his eyes. He was cleaning his fingernails with the tip of his knife. "He ain't natural, Slade." The rockslide, it was like the mountain itself took a side. "The mountain didn't do a damn thing," Slade spat. He walked over and kicked Tector's boot, hard. The knife clattered on the stone. "He got lucky. You got scared. That's the whole story. Paco's dead. The kid is dead. Gus is dead. That ain't luck, Slade. That's a reckoning." Tector looked up, and for a second, the fear in his eyes was replaced by something else. Defiance. Slade smiled. A cold, ugly thing. He drew his pistol, the motion a fluid blur. He didn't point it at Tector. He aimed it at the boy. Harlan froze, his face going pale. "You see, Tector," Slade said, his voice soft. "The problem is, you're thinking about this all wrong. You're thinking about the dead men. I'm thinking about the $100,000 that man is carrying in a bag. You think I'm gonna let that go because you've lost your nerve?" "No," Tector said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we can't find him. Not up there." He nodded toward the distant cinder peaks. "We ain't trackers. We don't have to be," Slade said. He holstered his pistol. Harlan started breathing again. "A man is bit. A man has no water. He can drink horseblood for a day, maybe, but sooner or later, he has to have water. Real water. And there's only one place to get it, on the far side of those peaks." Tector looked at him, the twitch in his eyes starting up again. "Pilgrim's Rest. An old man in a well." Slade said, "That's all that's there. Our boy will crawl there on his hands and knees before another day is out. He has to." He walked to his horse and checked the cinch, pulling the strap tight. "We're not going to follow him through the rocks. We're going to ride around, and we're going to be waiting for him when he comes down for a drink." He swung himself into the saddle and looked down at the 2 men. "Or, you 2 can stay here and wait for the sheriff to find you." "Your choice." Tector got to his feet, a sullen look on his face. He picked up his knife and shoved it in its sheath. The boy was already on his horse, his eyes fixed on Slade, a look of grim understanding on his young face. They were riding with him, not because they wanted to, but because they were more afraid of Slade than they were of any ghost climbing through the mountains. The world was made of black glass. The rock under Rip's boots was sharp, shattered obsidian that sliced at the worn leather. It reflected the sun, throwing the heat back in his face. Every breath was a lungful of fire. He moved from one sliver of shadow to the next, a hunched, ragged shape in a landscape that God had forgotten to finish. His good hand was raw, the skin scraped from the rock. His left was a dead weight, a constant, throbbing reminder of the snake. The poison was a dull fire in his joints. He didn't think about thirst anymore. He'd moved past it, into a place of dry, floating calm. His tongue was a piece of wood in his mouth. He didn't care. Legs, Corporal, that's all you are. Just legs. You tell them to move, they move. You stop telling them, you die. Simple. The voice of the corporal was company. It kept the silence from getting too loud. Heard you, Rip mumbled, his lips cracked and stiff. He stumbled, his boot catching on a razor edge of rock. He went down hard, his chin striking the ground. He tasted blood, a welcome wetness in the desert of his mouth. He lay there, the sun, a hammer on his back. It would be easy to close his eyes. Just for a minute, the boy, Miller, knelt beside him, his face shimmering in the heat. He wasn't holding a rifle this time. He was holding a tin cup of water. He swirled it, the sound of it impossibly loud. You look tired, Rip, Miller said, his voice soft as dust. You should rest. It's over. Rip stared at the cup. He could see the condensation on the tin. He could almost feel the cold of it. Don't you look at it. The corporal's voice cut in, sharp as a bayonet. It's a lie. You know it's a lie. You look at it, you believe it. You're dead. You're dead. Get up. Can't. Rip breathed into the sharp black gravel. Sure you can, Miller said, his voice kind, but you don't have to. No one's watching this time. No one to see you quit. Rip pushed a hand under him. The small sharp rocks dug into his palm. He pushed himself to his knees. The world spun. Miller and his cup of water dissolved. The corporal was back. On your feet, soldier, on your goddamn feet. Rip stood, swaying. He slung the saddlebag, the dead weight of it pulling on his raw shoulder. He looked ahead. The black peaks went on forever. There was no way through. Then he saw it. Not a ghost, not a trick of the heat. A dark slash in the side of a mountain, half hidden by a rock slide. The gray weathered timbers of a mine entrance. It was a long way off, a mile, maybe two. It didn't matter. It was a destination. It was a reason to take another step. He walked. He didn't know how long it took. The sun crawled across the sky. He kept his eyes on the black rectangle of the mine. It grew closer, an inch at a time. He fell twice more. The second time, he didn't think he was getting up, but the corporal yelled at him, and he did. He stumbled under the main timber and out of the sun. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. The sudden relief was so intense it made him dizzy. He leaned against the rough-hewn wall, his legs shaking, and slid to the floor. He sat in the deep, silent dark for a long time. The world outside, the world of sun and heat and black glass, ceased to exist. There was only the cool and the quiet. He untied the strip of shirt and looked at his arm. The swelling had gone down a little, but the skin from his hand to his elbow was a mottled, angry purple. He could move his fingers a little. He felt his way deeper into the tunnel. His hand brushed against something wet. He stopped. He fumbled in his pocket for the small tin of sulfur matches. One left. He scraped it against the rock wall. The flare of it was blinding. In the small, sputtering light, he saw it. A seep, a dark stain of moisture running down the rock wall, collecting in a shallow, scummy pool on the tunnel floor. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it, plunging the world back into darkness. He didn't care. He crawled to the pool. He smelled it first. Stale, metallic. He didn't care. He put his face to the water and drank. It was thick, gritty, and tasted of rust and rot. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He drank until his stomach hurt. Then he rolled onto his back. The cool, damp earth, a blessing against his fevered skin. He had found water. He had survived. He closed his eyes. From far away, down the tunnel, he heard a sound. A boot heel, striking a loose stone. He was not alone in the dark. The sound was a single, sharp mistake. A boot heel on loose stone. It was enough. Rip's head came off the damp earth. The brief, water-soaked piece shattered. He wasn't a man anymore. He was an animal in a hole. He grabbed the leather strap of the saddlebag and pulled it to him, the paper inside rustling. He moved without thinking, crab crawling away from the pool of water, deeper into the absolute black of the mine. His good hand closed around a rock the size of a loaf of bread. He flattened himself against a wall of cold, wet stone and waited, his breath held tight in his chest. The silence stretched. He heard his own blood pounding in his ears. Then a voice, calm and unhurried, drifted out of the darkness from the direction of the mine's entrance. You found the water. Good for you. I was starting to think I'd be tracking a corpse. The voice was quiet. It wasn't Slade. It wasn't the law. It was the other one. The one who moved like a cat. McCrae ripped in an answer. He adjusted his grip on the rock. No sense in hiding. McCrae's voice continued, a conversational tone that made the hairs on Rip's neck stand up. There's only one way in and one way out, and I'm standing in it. He paused. You're quiet. That's smart. But I can hear you breathing. Sounds like a bellows with a hole in it. Snakebite will do that to a man. Rip pressed himself harder against the wall. The rock was slick with moisture. I'm not Slade, McCrae said. I don't want your blood. I just want what you're carrying. The banker in Harmony Creek is missing a bag. Looks a lot like the one you got slung over your shoulder. What's it to you? Rip's voice was a dry rasp, a sound he didn't recognize as his own. A soft chuckle echoed in the tunnel. $2,000. That's what it is to me. You leave the bag. You walk out of here. I'll even leave you my canteen. There's a town a day's ride from here. You might even make it. Rip thought about it. The offer hung in the cool dead air. A canteen, a chance. All he had to do was give up the one thing that was keeping him hunted, the one thing that was keeping him alive. How do I know you won't just shoot me in the back? Rip asked. You don't, McCrae said, but your other choice is to die in this hole. The poison will get you, or I will. I'm patient. A match scraped against stone. A sudden flare of yellow light bloomed near the mine's entrance. It pushed the darkness back, throwing long, dancing shadows down the tunnel. In the flickering light, Rip saw him. McCrae was leaning against a timber, his posture relaxed. He held a Colt in his right hand, but it was pointed at the floor. His face was calm, his eyes taking in everything. The light caught Rip too. It showed him backed into a shallow alcove, his face a mask of dried blood and dirt, his left arm a swollen, purple mess. He looked like a man who'd already been buried once and had to dig his way out. He looked like hell. The match burned down to McCrae's fingers. He dropped it with a hiss into a puddle on the floor. The darkness crashed back in, thicker than before. You look worse than you sound, McCrae's voice said out of the black. That's a bad bite. You've got another 12 hours, maybe. Before your blood turns to mud? He was right. Rip could feel it. The fire in his arm had become a deep, cold ache. A numbness was spreading through him. The bag, McCrae said again, his voice losing its easy tone, replaced by a hard edge of business. Leave it by the water and walk out. Rip shifted his weight. The rock in his hand felt heavy, solid. He could throw it. He might get lucky. He might hit McCrae in the dark. He might also miss, and the next sound he'd hear would be the hammer clicking back on a Colt. You want it, Rip rasped, his own voice surprising him with its steadiness. You come in here and get it. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier. Final. Rip heard a soft scraping sound. The sound of a man sitting down, his back against the tunnel wall. All right, McCrae said, his voice once more calm, patient, resigned. I'll wait, but you'll get thirsty again. Time in the dark wasn't time. It was a thick, cold liquid. It dripped. Rip measured it by the throbbing in his arm and the growing dryness in his throat. He'd had his drink, but the thirst was already coming back, a slow tide of grit and want. He could hear McCrae breathing, a slow, steady rhythm near the mine's entrance. The sound was maddening. It was the sound of a man who had a full canteen. You still with me? McCrae's voice came out of the black, startlingly close. Rip didn't move. Figured you were, McCrae said. A man who walks through what UVA walked through, docenti, just lay down and quit. But the snake doesn't care how tough you are. It's got all the time in the world. He paused. Rip heard a faint metallic click, the sound of a canteen cap being unscrewed. Then, the soft, agonizing sound of a man taking a long, slow drink. Rip closed his eyes. He saw the boy, Miller, holding out the tin cup. It's a lie. The corporal's voice snapped in his head. He's playing with you. Get up. Find a way out. Rip pushed the ghost away. He started to move, not toward the entrance, but along the wall, away from the pool of water. His fingers, raw and scraped, read the stone. It was rough, slick with algae, and cold. He slid his boots along the floor, an inch at a time, making no sound. The rock he was holding was his only weapon. It felt slick with the sweat from his palm. Getting restless? McCrae asked, thirsty again. Rip kept moving. The wall curved, then straightened. His fingers brushed against something that wasn't rock. Wood, a support timber half-rotted, covered in a skin of cold fungus. He felt around it. The tunnel went on, but beside the timber, there was a gap, a crack in the world. He felt a faint, cool draft on his cheek. Air coming from somewhere else. He squeezed into the gap. It was a fissure, no wider than his shoulders. He had to turn sideways to get in, the saddlebag a dead lumpy weight against his hip. The rock tore at his shirt, at his skin. What was that? McCrae's voice, sharp now, alert. You're making noise in there. Rip froze. He held his breath. He was wedged in the crack, his heart hammering. A match scraped light flared behind him, casting his elongated shadow down the narrow fissure. He saw a tight, ascending chimney of rock ahead of him. It wasn't a way out. It was a tomb. I hear you, McCrae said, his voice closer now. Don't make me come in there after you. The match went out. The darkness returned. Rip didn't have a choice. He started to climb. He used his knees, his back, his good arm. He jammed his boots into cracks in the rock and pushed himself upward. The saddlebag was an anchor, catching on every outcrop, trying to pull him back down. His swollen arm screamed, a hot agony every time it brushed against the stone. He ignored it. Pain is a luxury. Corporal, remember. He climbed, he scraped his way upward in the absolute black, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling the tight space. He felt the draft grow stronger, the air tasting cleaner, less like rot and damp earth. He saw a faint gray light above him. Not sunlight, starlight. He pulled himself over the lip of the opening and collapsed onto a narrow ledge, his chest heaving. He was out. He was on the side of the mountain, 100 feet above the mine entrance, with the whole stardusted sky above him. The air was cold and clean. He lay there for a minute, maybe more, letting the blessed cold seep into him. He was alive. He was free. He looked down. He could just make out the black rectangle of the mine entrance below. As he watched, a tiny flower of light bloomed there. A match. McCrae was getting impatient. Rip got to his knees. He untied the knot on his makeshift sling, his fingers clumsy. He needed his other hand. He took the swollen, useless thing and began to massage it, forcing the blood to move, gritting his teeth against the pain. He had to keep going. Down below, Flint McCrae lit his third match. He walked a few steps into the mine. The air was still. He saw the scummy pool of water. He saw the scuffs in the dirt where a man had crawled away from it, but the man was gone. He held the match high. The light caught a fresh scrape on the wall, leading to a narrow black fissure he hadn't noticed before. The match burned out. McCrae stood in the dark and smiled. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered to the empty mine. The cold was a clean, sharp knife. It cut through the fever and the dull, swampy heat of the poison. Rip lay on the ledge, the granite sucking the warmth from his body, and watched the stars. There were too many of them. A whole universe of cold, distant fires, and he was a bug stuck to the side of a rock. He pushed himself to a sitting position, his back against the mountain. He had to move. McCrae wasn't the kind of man to wait for sunrise. He'd be moving now, circling the base of this rock pile, waiting for Rip to come down. McCrae would figure the angles. He'd be waiting at the easiest spot. Rip looked down the far side. It wasn't a cliff, but it wasn't a slope either. It was a steep, chaotic jumble of shattered rock and loose scree, disappearing into a blackness so deep it felt like the end of the world. "Good ground for an ambush," the corporal's voice said, calm and professional. "You go down there, you're walking into a kill zone." "He's not there yet," Rip whispered, his breath a white plume in the cold air. He had to go down the hard way, the way no one would expect. He started working his swollen hand, the fingers stiff and clumsy as frozen sausages. He forced them to bend, a hot, grinding pain shooting up to his elbow. He needed the hand. He needed two of them to get down. Down below, Flint McCrae led his horse out from the scrub, where he'd left it tied. He didn't look up the mountain. No point. The ghost was gone. He gave his horse a drink from his canteen, then took one himself. He walked to the mine entrance and looked at the tracks in the dust. His own, and the scuffed, dragging prints of the man he was hunting. He saw the fissure in the rock, a black crack leading straight up. "You're a climber," McCrae said to the empty night. He swung into his saddle. "Let's see how you are with the coming down." He didn't ride hard. He walked the horse in a wide, patient circle around the base of the mountain, his eyes scanning the ridgeline, looking for the path of least resistance, the path a tired, wounded man would choose. Rip didn't choose the easy path. He slung the saddlebag over his back, the weight of it settling between his shoulder blades. He turned and faced the rock, his belly pressed against the cold stone. He found a hold with his good hand, tested it, then started down, feeling for his next foothold with the toe of his boot. It was slow, blind work. The rock was sharp and unforgiving. It tore at his clothes and scraped the skin from his knuckles. His bad arm was a liability, a club he had to jam into crevices, hoping it would hold. A rock broke loose under his boot. He slid a dozen feet of heart-stopping freefall before his other boot caught on a ledge no wider than his hand. He hung there, his face pressed to the stone, the saddlebag trying to pull him off into the void. He waited for his heart to stop hammering. Then he started moving again, one hold at a time. An hour later, Sheriff Brody and Jericho reined in their horses near the mine. The moon was up, a sliver of bone, and it gave the land a dead silver light. "He was here," Jericho said. He wasn't looking at the ground, he was smelling the air. "Two men, one is gone, the other is still close." Brody dismounted, his joints stiff. McCrae, Jericho slid from his pony and walked to the mine entrance. He knelt, his fingers brushing the dust. He didn't need light. He read the story with his hands. "McCrae waited here," he said, his voice flat. "Our man was inside." He pointed. "He drank from the bad water." Brody looked into the black mouth of the mine. "How'd he get past him?" Jericho stood and walked to the fissure in the rock. He put a hand on the stone. "He didn't," he said. He went up. Brody looked at the chimney, a vertical crack of blackness going up into the night. He looked at Jericho. The tracker's face was unreadable in the moonlight. "A snake-bit man climbed that," Brody said. It wasn't a question, it was disbelief. "The tracks don't lie," Jericho said. He looked toward the bulk of the mountain. McCrae is hunting him now, circling like a hawk. Rip felt the ground level out under his boots. He was down. He stumbled away from the rock face and fell to his knees in the soft sand of the wash, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had made it. He looked back the way he had come. The mountain was a black wall against the stars. It had saved him. It had almost killed him. He got to his feet. He was on the wrong side of the world, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing. But the mountain was between him and them. For now, he looked east, where the sky was a shade less black. He picked a direction and started to walk. Just another shadow moving through a land of shadows. Dawn was a dirty gray line in the east. It gave the rocks shape but no color. Rip kept his eyes on that line. It was the only thing that was straight in a crooked world. He walked with his head down, following the curve of the wash, his boots sinking in the soft sand. The cold of the night had settled deep in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of a body shutting down. His bad hand throbbed with a dull, distant pulse. He could move the fingers now. Barely. They felt like someone else's. He'd stumble every 20 yards or so, catching himself before he fell. The saddlebag was a lead weight. He thought about leaving it, just dropping it in the sand and walking away. But it was the only thing they wanted. Without it, he was just another dead man in the desert. With it, he was a target. He wasn't sure which was worse. He came to a place where the wash split. One fork curved north, toward a series of low, broken mesas. The other continued east, widening out into a gravelly plain. High ground, the corporal's voice advised. Always take the high ground. Rip looked at the mesas. They offered cover, shade, a place to see what was coming. He turned and started walking north. Flint McCrae found the sign an hour after sunrise. It wasn't much, a single deep scrape in a rock face 10 feet from the wash, and below it, a scattering of pebbles that didn't belong. He dismounted and knelt, his fingers tracing the mark. He looked up at the impossible wall of rock Rip had come down. "You came down the front door," McCrae said, his voice soft with something that sounded like respect. "No wonder I missed you." He stood and scanned the ground. He found the place where Rip had fallen to his knees. He saw the first few dragging footprints heading into the wash. He looked east, then north toward the mesas. "You're hurt," McCrae said to his horse. "But you're not stupid." He swung back into the saddle, the leather creaking in the morning silence. He nudged the horse north. He didn't hurry. A hurried man misses things, and the ghost he was hunting didn't miss a thing. From the top of the mountain, Jericho watched McCrae through a pair of old brass field glasses. The bounty hunter was a small, dark figure moving slowly across the pale landscape below. "He found the trail," Jericho said. Sheriff Brody grunted. He'd spent the last 2 hours climbing a switchback mule trail to this vantage point, and his mood hadn't improved. "So we're just going to sit up here and watch." "The mountain is a wall," Jericho said, not lowering the glasses. "Our man put it between him and the mine. Now he will use the mesas as a shield." He lowered the glasses and looked at Brody. "He needs water, but he won't go to the river. Too open, too far. There is a place, a tinaja, a rock tank that holds the rain. It's deep in those mesas. You know this for a fact." Jericho pointed, not at the mesas, but further north, at a notch in the distant line of hills. "That pass leads to the old Verde Road. It's the only way out of this basin without crossing 50 miles of salt. The tinaja is 2 miles south of that pass. He will go there." Brody thought about it. The tracker's logic was like a map. Clean, simple, deadly, and McCrae. "McCrae is hunting the man," Jericho said. "We will hunt the water." He turned and started back toward their horses. The sun was a hammer by the time Rip reached the first of the mesas. He found a sliver of shade in a rock chimney and collapsed, his back against the cool stone. The world was a bright, painful glare. He closed his eyes. The boy, Miller, was there, sitting cross-legged, polishing the brass on his uniform belt buckle. "You look tired, Rip," Miller said without looking up. "I am," Rip rasped. "They're still coming, you know." "I know. You can't outrun them all." Miller finally looked up, his eyes old and sad in his young face. "You're just trading one ghost for another." Rip opened his eyes. He was alone in the shade. The silence buzzed with the heat. He pulled himself to his feet. He had to keep moving. He looked deeper into the maze of red rock. Somewhere in here, there had to be water. He could feel it, a desperate, animal certainty. He slung the saddlebag over his shoulder and started walking again. A man, following a ghost's advice, hunted by 2 more. The rock shimmered. The air was a thick, wavy glass that distorted everything. Rip put his good hand on a sandstone fin, the surface hot enough to cook meat. He leaned his weight on it, his head hanging. He was following a trail only he could see, a faint dark line of dampness in the sand that wasn't really there. An animal instinct, a ghost of a memory of water. The mesas were a labyrinth designed by a mad god. Every canyon looked the same. Every rock formation was a twin to one he'd passed an hour ago. He was walking in circles, he knew it, but the circles were getting smaller. "Tighter. You're being herded, soldier," the corporal's voice said, dry as dust. "You feel it." They're pushing you into the pocket. Shut up, Rip breathed. He slid down the rock and landed in the shade. The shade was a lie. It was just a different kind of heat. He looked at his swollen hand. The purple had faded to a mottled, sickly yellow at the edges. The poison was still in him, a slow engine of rot. He heard a sound, not a voice, not a horse, the buzz of a fly. Then another. He pushed himself to his feet and stumbled around a shoulder of rock. The tanaja wasn't beautiful. It was a wound in the stone, a deep bowl-shaped depression at the base of a cliff, maybe 50 feet across. The water in it was green and still, with a skin of algae and dead insects. But it was water. The flies buzzed in a thick, happy cloud over its surface. Rip didn't hesitate. He half slid, half ran down the sandy incline, the saddlebag thumping against his back. He fell to his knees at the edge, plunged his good hand into the lukewarm water, and brought it to his mouth. He drank, the water tasting of sun and rock and decay. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He drank again, then splashed the water on his face, washing away the salt and the grit. He leaned back on his heels, his head light, the world spinning in a slow, lazy circle. He was exposed. He knew it, a perfect target in the bottom of a bowl. He didn't care. He needed the water more than he needed to be safe. 2 miles away, Sheriff Brody dismounted and handed his reins to Jericho. They were on a high ridge overlooking the maze of canyons. "You're sure?" Brody asked, his voice low. Jericho didn't answer. He pointed. A thin column of disturbed dust, almost invisible against the rock, was settling in a canyon below them. It was a sign no one else would have seen. A man sliding down a sandy bank in a hurry. "He is thirsty," Jericho said. He unslung his rifle, the movement smooth and practiced. "We will go down on foot. The horses make too much noise." Brody pulled his own Winchester from its scabbard. "What about McCrae?" "He follows the tracks," Jericho said, his gaze sweeping the canyons to the south. "He is a straight line. We are a circle. The circle always arrives first." He started down a narrow, nearly invisible game trail, his moccasins making no sound on the rock. Flint McCrae saw the same sign. He wasn't on a ridge. He was in the maze, his horse picking its way carefully through the rocks. He saw the dust and reined in, his eyes narrowed. The trail he'd been following was clear, easy, a man getting tired, getting desperate. But the dust was wrong. It was too close, too sudden. "An ambush," he said to his horse. The animal's ears twitched. McCrae slid his pistol from its holster. He didn't like it. The ghost he was hunting wasn't the kind to set a clumsy trap, which meant someone else was here. He dismounted, tying his horse to a dead juniper. He would go the rest of the way on foot. He moved into the rocks, silent as a shadow, a hunter who knows he has just become the hunted. Rip filled his canteen. The simple act felt like a victory. He screwed the cap on tight. He sat by the water's edge, the saddlebag on the ground beside him. For the first time in days he felt something other than pain or thirst. He felt the weight of what he was doing. He unbuckled the straps on the bag and pulled out one of the bundles of bonds. The paper felt heavy, important, $1,000. It felt like a lifetime. He looked up at the rim of the bowl. Nothing but blue, empty sky. But the feeling was there. The skin on the back of his neck prickled. The silence was too loud. "You sat too long, soldier," the corporal whispered. "The party's here." Rip shoved the bonds back in the bag and buckled it. He got to his feet, his hand on the butt of his Colt. He scanned the rim again, his eyes searching every rock, every shadow. He was a rat in a bucket, and the owners of the bucket were looking down. He just couldn't see them yet. The voice came from the rock. It was calm and quiet, with no echo. A voice that knew how to use the landscape to its advantage. "You look like you've been through hell's own cookhouse, friend." Rip didn't jump. He didn't spin around. He brought the Colt up slow, the barrel level with his belt, and turned his head. He saw him then. Flint McCrae, 100 feet up, on the west rim of the bowl. He was half hidden behind a stack of weathered sandstone, just a hat brim and a rifle barrel showing. He wasn't aiming at Rip. The rifle was resting easy in the crook of his arm. "I've had better days," Rip said. His own voice was a stranger's, a raw croak. "I imagine you have," McCrae said. "The snake, the fall, losing your water. A man can only take so much punishment." "I'm still standing. For now." McCrae shifted, the movement economical. "I'm not Slade. I don't get paid to leave bodies in the sun. I get paid for delivery. Just the bag. You leave it by the water and walk north. I'll even leave you my canteen." Rip almost laughed. The sound was a dry cough. "And you'll just let me walk away?" "The banker didn't pay me to hunt a man," McCrae said. "He paid me to find his paper. Your quarrel is with the law, not with me. Seems to me my quarrel is with everyone." Rip took a half step to his left, putting a small rock outcrop between him and McCrae's line of sight. It wasn't much cover, but it was something. "You're a practical man," McCrae said, his voice still conversational. "I can see it. You didn't have to kill those boys Slade sent after you, but you did. You didn't have to climb that cliff face, but you did. You do what needs doing. What needs doing now is for you to drop that bag." Before Rip could answer, another voice cut through the hot, still air. This one came from the north rim, higher up. That's enough. McCrae, put the rifle down. Sheriff Brody stood in the open, a Winchester held steady at his hip. He wasn't hiding, he was making a statement. A few yards to his left, Jericho was a bronze statue, his own rifle aimed not at Rip, but directly at Flint McCrae. McCrae didn't move. He didn't even seem surprised. Sheriff, I was just negotiating the return of private property. I call it interfering with an arrest, Brody said, his voice flat and hard as the rock he was standing on. He looked down at Rip. You in the wash. You're wanted for the murder of Jedediah Croft and Cully Stevens. Throw down your weapon. Rip looked from Brody to McCrae. From the law to the money. He was pinned between them. The rat in the bucket. He didn't kill them, Sheriff, McCrae said, his voice lazy, almost amused. Slade's men did. Our friend here was just a passenger. I'll sort that out in a cell, Brody said. He's still a person of interest, and that bag is evidence. It's my client's collateral, McCrae countered. I have a contract. Your contract ends where my jurisdiction begins. Brody took a step closer to the rim. I won't say it again. McCrae, back away. The silence stretched. The sun beat down. The only sound was the buzz of flies over the green water. Rip could feel the sweat trickling down his spine. 3 men, 3 rifles, all wanting something different. And he was standing in the middle of it all. They're talking instead of shooting, the corporal's voice observed. That's bad. Soldier, it means they're thinking. A thinking man is more dangerous than a mad dog. Rip shifted his weight. His good hand was tight on the Colt. His bad hand ached with a dull, insistent fire. He looked at the sandy slope behind him. Too steep, too open. He looked at the sheer cliff face. No way up. It seems, Flint McCrae said, his voice breaking the silence, that we have a situation. He still hadn't moved. The rifle was still cradled in his arm. But Rip knew. McCrae had already made a choice. Brody had made his. Now it was his turn. And every choice he had left ended in smoke. Rip's mind was clear. The heat, the poison, the ghosts, they were all gone. There was only the geometry of the moment. 3 men on a triangle of rock, and him at the center. The bag, Rip said, his voice loud enough to carry to both rims. You both want it. What's in it that's worth all this? That's not your concern. Brody's voice boomed down. It's evidence. It's my payday, McCrae said, his voice a lazy drawl that didn't match the tension in the air. End of story. The banker, Abernathy, Rip said, his eyes on Brody. He seemed mighty nervous for a man just waiting on a regular shipment, almost like he was expecting it to go missing. He saw Brody shift his weight, a flicker of doubt. That was all Rip needed. You talk too much, McCrae said. He brought the rifle up, the movement a fluid, deadly thing. Jericho's rifle cracked. The shot was a flat, hard sound that bounced off the rock walls. It wasn't aimed at McCrae. It hit the stone a foot from his head, spraying a shower of sandstone chips. A warning. McCrae didn't flinch. His eyes were on Rip. That was the moment. Rip didn't draw his pistol. He didn't run. He grabbed the heavy leather saddlebag by the strap, swung it once, and threw it. Not at Brody, not at McCrae. He threw it high and out, a dark, spinning shape against the bright, empty sky. It landed with a flat, ugly splash in the center of the green tanaja. For a full second, nobody moved. The bag floated, obscene, on the scummy water. Bubbles gurgled up around it as it slowly, deliberately, began to sink. McCrae swore, a single, violent word. His payday was going to the bottom of a mudhole. He forgot about the sheriff. He forgot about Jericho. He brought his rifle to bear on Rip. Rip was already moving. He ran, not up the sandy slopes, but along the water's edge, directly toward the sheer southern cliff face that offered no escape. The world exploded in noise. McCrae's rifle boomed, the bullet slapping the water where Rip had been a second before. Jericho's rifle answered instantly, and McCrae grunted, stumbling back from the rim, his hat flying from his head. Brody was yelling something, lost in the echo of the shots. Rip reached the cliff. It wasn't a sheer wall. It was a mess of cracks and chimneys, a place a lizard might live. He found a handhold with his good hand, jammed the toe of his boot into a fissure, and started to climb. He was a perfect target, a black shape crawling up a red wall. Brody fired. The bullet went past Rip's ear and ricocheted off the rock with a high, angry scream. Rip didn't look back. He kept climbing, his muscles screaming, his bad hand a useless anchor. The rock scraped his skin raw. He risked a glance down. Brody was trying to get a clear shot, moving along the rim. Jericho was gone, probably dealing with McCrae. The saddlebag was a dark patch now, almost completely submerged in the green water. Rip found a ledge, a sliver of rock barely wide enough for his boots. He pressed his body flat against the cliff face, his cheek scraping the hot stone. He had to rest. His lungs were on fire. They expect you to go up, the corporal's voice said, calm in the middle of the chaos. Don't do what they expect. Rip looked sideways. A narrow chimney, a vertical crack in the rock, was 3 feet to his left. It was a tight squeeze, full of shadows. He launched himself sideways, his boots scrabbling for purchase. He caught the edge of the chimney and swung his body into the darkness. He was hidden. He leaned against the back of the chimney, the rock cool on his sweat-soaked shirt. He could hear Brody yelling his name from the rim above, his voice frustrated. He heard another shot, far off, a pistol this time. McCrae, he wasn't out of it yet. Rip looked up. The chimney went all the way to the top. It was a hard climb, but it was a climb in the dark. He took a breath, set his shoulders against the rock, and started to inch his way upward, leaving the battle at the waterhole behind him. Sheriff Brody stood on the rim rock, the Winchester hot in his hands. The canyon below was quiet again. Too quiet. He could see the dark, spreading stain of the saddlebag under the green water. He could not see Rip. The man had vanished into the rock itself. "He's gone," Brody said to the empty air. Jericho appeared at his side, moving without a sound. He held his rifle in one hand. The chimney he went up, a man with one good arm and a belly full of poison climbs a sheer cliff. Brody shook his head. "It doesn't make sense." "He is not a man who makes sense," Jericho said. He looked across the canyon to the opposite rim. "The other one, McCrae," Brody spat into the dust. "Go see if he's dead. If he isn't, tell him he has until the count of 10 to ride out of my jurisdiction before I put him in the ground, myself." Jericho nodded once and was gone, melting back into the rocks. Brody was alone. He looked down at the waterhole. His evidence was sinking in that filth. He holstered his pistol, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and started the long, careful climb down the sandy slope to the canyon floor. His boots sent small rivers of gravel sliding ahead of him. The air in the bowl was thick and smelled of stagnant water and decay. Flies buzzed over the surface of the Tinaja, a shimmering black cloud. Brody didn't hesitate. He took off his gun belt and hung it on a dead skeletal branch of a mesquite bush. He waded into the pool. The water was warm and slimy. The mud at the bottom sucked at his boots, trying to pull him down. It came up to his waist, the green scum clinging to his trousers. He felt around with his feet, his face a mask of disgust. He found it, a heavy, waterlogged lump. He bent over, plunged his arms into the foul water up to his elbows, and hauled the saddlebag out. It dripped green slime and stank of rot. He carried it to the bank and dropped it on the sand. He stood there for a moment, dripping, water running in rivulets from his clothes. He unbuckled the straps. The leather was slick and swollen. Inside, the bearer bonds were a sodden, pulpy mess. The ink was running on some of them, but they were mostly intact. A fortune in wet paper. He spread a few out on a flat, sun-baked rock to dry. He heard a scuff of boots behind him. Flint McCrae stood there, his left arm bound tight with a strip torn from his own shirt. A dark red stain was spreading through the makeshift bandage just below the shoulder. His hat was gone, and a long bloody scrape ran from his temple into his hairline. Jericho stood 20 feet behind him, his rifle held at a low, easy ready. "That's my property, Sheriff," McCrae said. His voice was tight with pain. "It's my evidence," Brody said, without turning around. "Jericho told you to ride." "He did, but I wanted to see the man who de-waded through hell for a bag of wet paper." McCrae took a step closer. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Brody. I'll give you that, and you're a ghoul who follows death for a living," Brody said. "Get on your horse." McCrae looked at the bonds drying on the rock. "You really think he killed those men on the wagon? The law says he's the prime suspect." McCrae laughed, a short, sharp sound that ended in a grunt of pain. "The law is an ass. That man is a survivor. He's not a backshooter. Slade is a backshooter, and the banker who hired him, Abernathy, he's the kind of man who pays other men to shoot people in the back." He looked up at the cliff where Rip had disappeared. "You're not just chasing a man anymore, Sheriff. You're chasing the truth, and it's going to get you killed. That's my business." "Fine," McCrae turned, then stopped. A piece of free advice. "When you get back to Harmony Creek, ask the banker why he was so eager to have his own property stolen. Ask him what's worth more to him than $100,000. He walked away, Jericho following him like a shadow. Brody watched him go. He looked down at the soggy bonds. He thought about Abernathy's pale, sweating face. He thought about a man with a snakebite climbing a sheer rock wall. McCrae was right. None of it added up. He wasn't just a lawman on a manhunt anymore. He was something else. He was the only man left who cared enough to find out why. He packed the wet bonds back into the saddlebag and started the long climb back up to the rim. The top of the chimney was a narrow slit that opened onto a wide, flat mesa baked the color of old blood. Rip slithered out of the rock and lay flat on the hot stone, his chest heaving. The air tasted thin and clean. Below, the canyon was a deep, silent wound in the earth. He was out. He rolled onto his back and stared at the empty blue sky. His left arm was a dead weight, the poison a deep, settled ache in the bone. The climb had torn the skin from the knuckles of his good hand. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts. Every muscle screamed, "You're exposed, soldier, find cover." The corporal's voice was faint now, a dry whisper of wind. Rip pushed himself up. He was on a high plateau, a vast, empty table of rock and sun-scorched scrub. He could see for 50 miles in every direction. The Cinder Peaks were a jagged black promise on the northern horizon. Harmony Creek was somewhere on the other side of them, a lifetime away. He looked back toward the canyon rim. He saw nothing. No movement. But he knew they were there. The sheriff and the tracker. They wouldn't quit. He had to move. He started walking north. His boots scuffed on the rock, the sound loud in the silence. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have water or food. All he had was distance. He put his head down and walked. A solitary, broken figure in a world of rock and light. Miles away, Flint McCrae sat his horse, his jaw tight. Jericho rode beside him, silent as a shadow, his rifle resting easy across his lap. They were heading south, away from the cinders, away from the hunt. He let me go, McCrae said, more to himself than to the tracker. Jericho didn't answer. His eyes scanned the horizon. Your sheriff gives an order. You follow it, McCrae went on, his voice a low rasp. But you could have finished it. Back on the rim, you had a clear shot. The shot I took was the one the sheriff wanted, Jericho said, his voice flat. McCrae grunted, shifting his weight in the saddle. The movement sent a fresh wave of fire through his wounded shoulder. He's a piece of work, your sheriff. Wading into that muck for a bag of paper. He's either the most honest man in the territory or the biggest fool. He is the law, Jericho said, as if that explained everything. The law, McCrae spat. The law is what men with money say it is. You tell Brody to stop looking at the man running and start looking at the man who sent him, Abernathy. They rode in silence for another mile. The sun was hot on McCrae's neck. He felt lightheaded from the blood loss. This is far enough, McCrae said, pulling his horse to a halt. You can go back and tell your boss you saw me off the property. Jericho stopped and looked at him. His face was unreadable. You are not going back to town. It wasn't a question. I've got business in Sterling first, McCrae said. A man I need to talk to. A man who used to ride with Slade. He gave Jericho a look that was pure, cold calculation. There's more than one way to get paid. The banker is holding the purse strings, but Slade is the one holding the knife. You can't have one without the other. Jericho just watched him. You tell Brody that, McCrae said. He turned his horse west, toward Sterling. Tell him the game isn't over. It's just getting interesting. He spurred his horse and rode away without looking back. A lone rider with a bloody shirt and a new idea. Jericho watched until he was a small speck in the shimmering heat. Then he turned and rode back toward the Tainaja. He found Brody on the rim, the wet bonds laid out on his saddle blanket, drying in the sun. The saddlebag lay beside them, stained and stinking. He's gone, Jericho said. Rode for Sterling. Said to tell you the game is just getting interesting. Brody grunted. He say anything else? He said to ask the banker who holds the knife. Brody stood up and looked north, across the empty mesa where Rip had disappeared. He thought of Abernathy's sweating, nervous face. He thought of McCrae, a man who would ride into hell for money, now talking about games and knives. Find his trail, Jericho, Brody said, his voice quiet. Jericho knelt. He scanned the rock, his eyes seeing a story no one else could. He pointed to a faint scuff mark, a single, clear boot print in a patch of dust. He went that way, north toward the cinders. Jericho looked up. He walked like a man who knows he is being followed, but he is not running. Brody packed the half-dry bonds back into the saddlebag. He was tired. His bones ached. He wanted a hot meal and a clean bed, but he was closer to something than he had been in a long time. Not just to a man, but to a reason. Let's go, he said, swinging into his saddle. I want to hear his side of the story before this goes any further. They rode north following a trail only one of them could see. Two patient hunters chasing a ghost into the falling night. The sun hammered the rock, and the rock threw the heat right back. Rip walked through a world made of glare. His shadow was a short, dark thing that clung to his boots. He'd stopped sweating hours ago. His skin was tight and dry, caked with dust and salt. Water discipline, soldier. You sip, you don't gulp. Don't have any to sip, Rip rasped. His tongue was a piece of dry wood. He stumbled, his boot catching on a crack in the stone. He didn't fall. Falling was a luxury. It meant you had the strength to get up again. He just stood there, swaying, the whole world tilting on a slow, greasy axis. The cinder peaks were still there, a black saw against the sky. They weren't getting any closer. He thought he saw a man waiting for him, standing by a scrub juniper half a mile ahead. A ghost in a dusty blue uniform. Miller. The boy was holding out his canteen again. Rip didn't even try to reach for it this time. He just blinked, and the boy dissolved into the heat shimmer. He is slowing, Jericho said. Sheriff Brody looked at the scuff mark in the dirt. It was deeper than the last one. The toe dragged. So are we. He wiped a sleeve across his forehead, smearing the grime. The horses' heads were low, their steps a slow, plodding rhythm. Brody looked at the sky to the west. A dark line was building on the horizon, the color of a fresh bruise. Storm's coming. An hour, maybe two, Jericho said. It will wash out the trail. Then we'd better be closer than we are now. Brody nudged his horse forward. The animal grunted but obeyed. He looked at the vast, empty mesa ahead. He felt like he was chasing a rumor. A man couldn't survive out here this long. Not on foot, not wounded. Yet the trail went on. What do you think is keeping him going? Jericho considered the question for a long time. He does not believe he can die, he said, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. The town of Sterling smelled of stale beer, cheap perfume, and manure. It was a place where men came to spend their money and lose their tempers. Flint McCrae rode down the single dusty street, his eyes scanning the saloons. He ignored the gilded cage with its fancy etched windows. He passed the Sterling Saloon. He stopped in front of a place called the Waterhole. The sign was faded, the wood warped. It was the right kind of place. He swung down from his horse, the movement stiff. The pain in his shoulder was a hot, steady throb. He tied the reins to the hitching post and pushed through the batwing doors. The place was dark and mostly empty. A bartender with a face like a sour dishcloth was wiping the bar. Two old prospectors were arguing in a corner. At a back table, a man sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey. He was thick in the shoulders, with a scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. McCrae had seen him before, riding with Slade's crew. His name was Cale. McCrae walked to the bar. Whiskey. The bartender poured a shot without a word. McCrae took the glass and walked to the back table. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. Cale looked up, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol tucked into his belt. "Table's taken. I'm not looking for company," McCrae said. He pushed a $5 gold piece across the table. "I'm looking for information." Cale looked at the coin, then at McCrae's face. "I seen you Harmony Creek. You're the bounty man. I'm the man who pays for what he wants." McCrae nudged the coin closer. "I hear Slade took a job for the banker, Abernathy, a simple payroll snatch." "Only it wasn't simple." Cale's eyes narrowed. "I don't know any Slade. He left you behind after the rock slide," McCrae said, his voice quiet. "Left you and two others for dead. A man does that. He doesn't have friends. He just has witnesses." Cale's hand tightened on his pistol. "That payroll," McCrae went on, ignoring the threat. "It wasn't payroll, was it? It was bearer bonds. But there was something else in that wagon. Something the banker wanted gone, even more than he wanted the bonds. Something in a canvas-wrapped crate." McCrae leaned forward. "What was in the crate, Cale?" Cale stared at him, the sneer on his face twitching. He looked at the gold coin. He looked at the door. Rip felt the first gust of wind. It was hot, like the breath from an oven, and it carried the smell of rain. He stopped and lifted his head. The dark line in the west had grown, swallowing the blue sky. A low rumble echoed across the mesa, a sound you felt in your bones. He saw a flicker of lightning, a silent, angry nerve spasming inside the cloud. The air grew heavy, thick with a waiting stillness. The sun was gone, hidden behind the approaching wall of darkness. He started walking again, faster now. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to be somewhere else when the sky broke open. A single drop of rain, fat and heavy, hit the back of his neck. It wasn't cool, it was warm as blood. Then, another hit his cheek. He stopped and turned his face to the sky, his mouth open, as the first scattered drops began to fall on the thirsty rock. The rain did not fall, it attacked. One moment there were scattered, heavy drops. The next the sky tore open, and a solid, blinding sheet of water hammered the mesa. It hit the baked rock with a sound like 1,000 drums. Rip stood in the middle of it, his head tilted back, his mouth open. The water was gritty, tasting of the red dust the wind had whipped into the air. He didn't care. It was water. He drank until he choked, sputtering, the cold shock of it making him gasp. It wasn't relief, it was a violent resurrection. Lightning spider webbed across the black sky, a silent, flickering web of white fire. And the thunder that followed was not a rumble, but a physical blow that shook the rock under his boots. The wind came in a solid wall, trying to tear him from his feet. The world was noise and water and flashing. Momentary light. He was going to drown on a desert mesa. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He started moving, half-blinded, leaning into the wind. In one of the lightning flashes, he saw it, a dark slash in the ground 100 yards away. A washout, a place where the water ran when it came. It was either a trap or a tomb, but it was the only shelter in a world that had come apart. He stumbled toward it, the ground turning to slick, treacherous mud under his boots. He slid the last 10 feet, landing hard in the shallow arroyo. A river of red water, already a foot deep, was tearing through it. He pressed himself against the cut bank, under a small overhang of rock and roots, and watched the storm try to kill the world. "It is gone," Jericho said. He did not have to raise his voice. The wind snatched the words away. He and Sheriff Brody were huddled in the lee of a granite outcrop, a formation of rocks that looked like a giant's fist. The horses stood behind them, heads down, tails to the wind, miserable. The rain came down so hard it bounced a foot off the ground. "The trail," Brody yelled over the roar. Jericho just looked at him. The question was foolish. There was no trail. There was no ground. There was only a moving sea of red water. "He can't survive this," Brody said, more to himself than the tracker. No man could. Jericho pulled the collar of his slicker tighter around his neck. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. He is not a man, he is a piece of the storm. He will find a place. He looked out into the gray, driving chaos. The water gives him life. He takes away his tracks. It is his friend now. Brody watched a river form where there had been a dusty plain an hour ago. He thought of the wet, pulpy bonds in his saddlebag. Evidence it felt like a joke. He was chasing a man through a flood for a bag of wet paper, and the man he was chasing was more ghost than flesh. We wait for the rain to stop, Brody said. Then we ride for the cinders. He was heading north. We'll pick up his trail on the other side. Jericho nodded slowly. If he makes it to the other side. In Sterling, the rain hammered on the saloon's tin roof. A relentless, deafening drumbeat. Inside, it was dark, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and whiskey. Flint McCrae pushed the $5 gold piece across the table again. It sat in a small puddle of spilled whiskey. Slade isn't coming back for you, Cale. He's cutting his losses. You were a loss. Cale stared at the coin. His hand hovered over the butt of his pistol, but there was no conviction in it. What was in the crate? McCrae's voice was low, patient. Books. Cale finally mumbled, his eyes darting toward the door. School books, Bibles. Ledgers, Cale said. He licked his lips. From the bank, McCrae leaned back, a slow smile touching his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. Abernathy's books. His real books. Slade was supposed to take the bonds and the crate, burn the crate, make it look like a simple robbery gone wrong. Nobody was supposed to get killed. Cale looked at McCrae, his face a mask of sweat and fear. But the walker, the man on foot, he showed up. He wasn't part of the plan. He grabbed the wrong bag and ran, and Slade couldn't leave a witness. McCrae finished for him. He said the books were the real prize. Cale whispered. He said they were worth 10 times the bonds to the right people. Proof of every crooked loan, every foreclosure, every land grab. Abernathy's been running for 5 years, so that was it. Not a robbery. It was a cleaning service. Abernathy hadn't been robbed. He'd hired Slade to steal and destroy the evidence of his own crimes. And Rip had walked right into the middle of it and walked out with the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. McCrae stood up. He left the gold coin on the table. He did the right thing, Cale. He walked to the door, the pain in his shoulder a dull, steady fire. He had it now. He had the whole story. He pushed through the batwing doors and into the deluge, a man with a purpose. He wasn't hunting a bounty anymore, he was hunting a banker. Rip lay under the overhang, the red water rushing past his boots. He scooped it up in his good hand, letting the grit settle before he drank. It was mud, but it was life. The deep, throbbing ache of the poison in his arms seemed to lessen, diluted by the water. He was cold. He was shivering. But for the first time in days, he wasn't thirsty. The storm had washed the world clean. It had washed him clean. He had no trail. He had no name. He was just a man, waiting for the rain to stop. Chapter 28. World was born again, wet and clean. The storm had passed, leaving a sky the color of washed-out denim and air that smelled of rain and sage. Rip crawled out of the arroyo, his boots sinking in the soft red mud. The water had scoured him, taking the fever with it. The poison was a dull, sleeping ache now, no longer a fire. His thirst was gone. He stood in a landscape of shining rock and temporary rivers. Every crack and crevice gushed with water, the desert drinking its fill. His trail was gone, washed away as if he had never existed. He was a ghost with a new start. He looked north. The cinder peaks seemed closer, their black edges sharp against the clean sky. He started walking. He didn't hear a horse. He didn't hear a boot scrape on rock. He saw a shadow detach itself from a tall slab of sandstone, and a man stepped out. Flint McCrae stood 100 feet away, a rifle held easy in the crook of his arm. His horse was behind the rock, out of sight. McCrae's shirt was dark with old blood at the shoulder. But he stood as if he'd been waiting for a stagecoach, patient and still. Rip didn't stop. He didn't run. He changed direction, moving deliberately toward a jumble of granite boulders that offered the only cover on the flat, wet stone. No need for that. McCrae's voice carried on the clean air. We're past the running part. Rip reached the boulders and slid behind the biggest one. He sank to one knee, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. The rock was cool and damp. He peered around the edge. McCrae hadn't moved. He hadn't even raised the rifle. You look like hell, McCrae said. It wasn't an insult, it was a statement of fact. You're not looking so good yourself, Rip answered. McCrae touched his wounded shoulder, a small, thoughtful gesture, a misunderstanding. We've got bigger problems. He took a few steps closer, stopping in the open. He was giving Rip a chance. Or a target, the bag you threw in the waterhole. I hear the sheriff fished it out. It was heavy, Rip said. Paper usually is, when it's soaked, but that wasn't the prize, was it? You grabbed the wrong bag. Rip watched him, saying nothing. I had a talk with one of Slade's men over in Sterling, McCrae said. He was talking to the rock, but the words were for Rip. A fellow named Cale. He was feeling chatty. Turns out, Abernathy, the banker, wasn't getting robbed. He was paying for a cleaning service. The pieces clicked into place in Rip's mind. The 2 dead men on the wagon seat, the ambush that was too clean, too fast. There was a crate in that wagon. McCrae went on, confessed, wrapped, full of the bank's real ledgers. Proof of every crooked deal he's run for the last 5 years. Slade was supposed to snatch the bonds to make it look good, and burn the crate. Make the evidence disappear. Jed and Cully, they weren't killed in a robbery. They were part of the cleanup. Loose ends, just like Rip had almost been. The thought landed like a stone in his gut. You walked into the middle of it, McCrae said, grabbed the bag with the bonds, the one thing that made it look legitimate, and ran. Slade couldn't have that. Abernathy couldn't have that. A witness with the wrong prize. So what do you want? Rip asked. What I was hired for. My money. McCrae took another step. Only now, the payday isn't the bounty on a bag of wet paper. The payday is the banker. That's your business. It could be, McCrae said, his eyes fixed on the edge of the rock hiding Rip, or it could be ours. A man with those ledgers could make a banker like Abernathy dance, but Slade has them now. He'll be on his way to make his own deal. McCrae paused. This is my play now, Rip. I'm going after the real money. You're a loose end, I don't need. The air grew still. The water had stopped dripping from the rocks. The desert was listening. You can walk away, McCrae said, his voice flat. Head north into the cinders. Disappear. I'll forget I saw you. The sheriff can chase your ghost all the way to Utah. Rip thought of the driver spitting tobacco juice. He thought of the guard offering him a ride. They weren't ghosts. Their faces were clear in his mind. Walking away meant leaving them behind. It meant letting men like Abernathy and McCrae carve up the world for profit. And if I don't, Rip said. McCrae's smile was a thin, bloodless line. He didn't have to answer. He shifted his weight, and the rifle came up, the movement easy and practiced. It's a shame, he said. You've been interesting to hunt. Rip's hand closed around the grip of the Colt. The hammer came back with a soft, oily click. The sound was loud in the sudden, waiting silence. The rifle barrel was a black, unblinking eye. McCrae held it steady, his cheek tight against the smooth wood of the stock. He wasn't aiming at the rock. He was aiming at the space where a man's head would appear. Rip didn't give him the target. He stayed low, the Colt heavy in his good hand. He could hear the soft drip of water from the ledge above him. A slow, patient clock ticking off the last seconds of a man's life. Maybe McCrae's. You think about it too long, you lose. McCrae said, his voice a low murmur. You should know that. R.I.P. knew it. He'd learned it in a field of wet grass outside a church in Tennessee. Thinking was what got Miller killed. He thumbed the hammer back on his Colt. Don't fight the man, the corporal's voice said, clear as a bugle call in his mind. Fight the ground he stands on. Rip looked at the wet, muddy earth in front of his boulder. It was soft, churned up by the rain. A patch of it was almost liquid. He fired. The shot was deafening in the clean air. It didn't go toward McCrae. It hit the mud 10 feet in front of him. The bullet slapped into the red sludge, sending a spray of wet grit and rock fragments up and out. It was enough. McCrae flinched. Not a lot, just a tightening of his eye, an involuntary jerk as the mud peppered his face. His rifle wavered for a fraction of a second. Rip was already moving. He didn't rise. He rolled out from behind the boulder, his bad arm screaming a protest. He fired again from the ground, the pistol bucking in his hand. The bullet took McCrae in the thigh. It wasn't a clean shot. It tore through the muscle, spinning him around. The rifle fired, a convulsive reaction, the shot going wild and harmless into the gray sky. McCrae went down on one knee, his face a mask of surprise and white-hot pain. He tried to bring the rifle back around, but his leg wouldn't hold him. He collapsed onto his side, the rifle clattering on the wet rock. Rip was on his feet, walking toward him. The Colt held steady. He stopped a few feet away, the muzzle pointed at the center of McCrae's chest. McCrae looked from the hole in his leg to Rip's face. There was no fear in his eyes, just a kind of weary, professional curiosity. You had the headshot, he said, his voice tight with pain. Didn't want it, Rip said. Sloppy, clean enough. Rip looked at him for a long moment. He saw the 2 dead men on the wagon. He saw Miller's face. He saw a long line of ghosts. Killing this one wouldn't make them go away. It would just add another one to the procession. He lowered the pistol. We're done. He walked past McCrae to the tall slab of sandstone. The bounty hunter's horse, a fine-looking bay, stood waiting, its reins trailing. R.I.P. gathered them up. He walked back and picked up McCrae's rifle. He worked the lever, ejecting the spent shell, and tucked the weapon under his arm. He looked down at the man on the ground. There's a canteen on my saddle, McCrae grunted. You'll need it. Rip didn't answer. He swung up onto the bay. The movement, clumsy but sure. The horse was strong under him, its energy a stark contrast to the bone-deep weariness that had settled into Rip's soul. He looked down the trail he had walked, a long winding path of rock and mud and blood. Then he looked toward Harmony Creek. A cold drizzle had started to fall again, the sky closing in, soft and gray. It would cover his tracks. R.I.P., McCrae called out. His voice was strained. Abernathy, he'll have men watching the town. You walk in the front door. You're a dead man. Rip didn't look back. He nudged the bay with his heels, and the horse moved. Harmony Creek was a town of mud and ghosts. The rain had turned the main street into a river of red sludge, the water pooling deep in the wagon ruts. No one was out. The windows of the saloon were steamed over. The livery door shut tight against the damp. It was a town holding its breath. Rip rode in from the north, not on the main trail, but through a stand of waterlogged cottonwoods that bordered the creek. He left McCrae's horse tied in the trees. Its reins looped over a low branch. The animal was tired, but it would be there if he needed it. He didn't think he would. He walked into town using the back alleys, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. He kept to the shadows of the overhangs, a gray man in a gray world. McCrae had warned him Abernathy would have men watching. He saw them. One, a man with a shotgun, sat in the dry spot on the undertaker's porch, pretending to whittle a stick. Another watched the street from the window of the assayer's office. Amateurs, they were looking for a man riding an owl, not a man who was already there. The back of the Harmony Creek Bank and Trust was a plain brick wall, with one window, barred, and a thick oak door. The door was unlocked. Men like Abernathy didn't worry about the back door. They worried about the front. The office smelled of wet wool, stale cigar smoke, and fear. Elias Abernathy was standing at his front window, staring out at the empty, muddy street. He was wearing the same wool vest, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't hear Rip come in. Rip closed the door. The click of the latch was loud in the quiet room. Abernathy spun around, his hand flying to his chest. His face, already pale, went the color of old paper. He saw a man who looked like he'd been dug out of a grave. Caked in mud, clothes in tatters, a face bruised and scraped, with a left arm lashed to his chest and a Colt in his right hand. You, Abernathy, breathe me, Rip said. His voice was a dry rasp. He walked to the center of the room, the pistol held easy at his side. He wasn't pointing it. He didn't need to. What do you want? Abernathy stammered, backing away until his desk pressed into his spine. The bonds, the sheriff has them. I don't know where they are. I don't want the bonds, Rip said. They were never the point, were they? He looked around the office. The fancy desk, the leather chairs, the framed map on the wall. This is a nice setup. Must have cost a lot of money. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Rip said. He took a step closer. Abernathy flinched. I think you know about a man named Slade, and a canvas-wrapped crate full of books. The color drained completely from Abernathy's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ledgers, Rip said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. Your real ledgers. The ones that show how you built all this. He gestured with the barrel of the Colt. Slade was supposed to burn them. Make it all look like a simple robbery. But he didn't. He has them now. I imagine he'll be asking for a lot more than you originally offered. This is insane, Abernathy whispered, his eyes darting toward the street. He was looking for his men with the guns. They're still out there, Rip said, reading his mind. But they're looking the wrong way. He laid McCrae's rifle on the banker's pristine desk. The wet, muddy stock left a smear on the polished wood. Jedediah and Cully. They were good men. They gave me a ride. The mention of the dead wagon drivers seemed to break something in Abernathy. His composure shattered, leaving only a raw, twitching fear. What do you want from me? Rip looked at the man. He saw the rot behind the starched collar. He thought of the long, bloody trail from the wagon to here. He thought of the ghosts. He didn't want money. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted it to be over. Nothing, Rip said. He turned and walked toward the back door. Wait, Abernathy cried out, a desperate, pleading sound. We can make a deal. Rip paused at the door, but he didn't look back. Your problem now. He stepped out into the gray afternoon and closed the door behind him. He didn't go for the horse. He walked around the building, out onto the main street, his boots sinking into the mud. He was done running. A single rider was coming into town from the south. Sheriff Brody. He saw Rip and reined in, his horse splashing in a deep puddle. The lawman's face was drawn and tired, his slicker covered in a week's worth of trail dust and rain. Jericho was 100 yards behind him, a silent shadow. Brody looked at Rip. He looked at the bank. He looked back at Rip. He saw the useless arm, the exhaustion that went deeper than bone. He saw a man who had been to hell and had unbothered to wipe his boots on the way back. The front door of the bank flew open. Sheriff Abernathy screamed, his voice cracking. That man. Arrest him. He robbed me. He threatened. Brody didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Rip. He nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible gesture. It was an ending. It was an understanding. Rip held his gaze for a moment, then turned and limped down the street, heading out of town the same way he'd come in. He didn't look back.